Men freeze in place, holding pickaxes and shovels at the ready inside a well-lit tunnel under the Mexican countryside. They can hear the vibrations of a vehicle above them and, wary of making any noise that might give them away, hold their work as the prison patrol passes overhead. 30 feet below the prison's main yard, there's little chance of being discovered. But after several months of secret tunneling, they can't take any chances, especially when they are so close to their goal. The prison cell of Mexico's most famous drug kingpin, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. For months, they've tunneled through solid rock with nothing more than pickaxes and shovels, moving as fast as they can with their limited equipment but with great caution. The work would go much faster if they could use modern tunnel digging equipment like jackhammers and boring machines. But not only would that create noise that might give them away, it would draw a great deal of attention to their staging area, just a mile from the prison perimeter. Prior to tunnel digging, El Chapo's powerful drug cartel purchased a small plot of land as close to the prison as they could get and began constructing 2 small homes as a cover for their real intentions. The homes never made it past a rough brick outer shell though, because of course they would not be inhabited. Instead, they provided the cover needed to start construction on the tunnel that would set El Chapo free. But the tunnel crew was facing incredible pressure to finish as quickly as possible. Due to his history of escaping from prison and evading police raids, Mexican authorities could at any time transfer El Chapo to another prison in order to foil any possible escape attempts. Every day the tunnelers took to get their boss was another day the entire thing could be for nothing, and a new escape attempt in a completely different location would have to be devised. But that's not all. The unfinished buildings were beginning to draw attention from local officials and curious villagers alike. Why would someone start construction on an empty piece of land and then suddenly stop with only a shell of a home built? Time was running out and pressure was mounting. Inside his cell, El Chapo was the model prisoner. Despite his long history of ordering some of the most horrific violence Mexico has ever seen, El Chapo maintained a cordial and even pleasant attitude with his prison guards and fellow inmates. His conversations over the phone were carefully monitored, his mail checked by prison officials, but not a single hint of the ongoing plot was ever revealed. El Chapo was a true professional by now and patient, but his patience was running out. The tunnel diggers faced a daunting task from the start, and they knew they had to move fast. Despite the incredible pressure on them, however, they managed to not only reach El Chapo before any potential prison transfer, but they wound up breaking through to El Chapo's cell just 16 months into his prison stay. The tunnel they constructed was sophisticated, impressing officials who would later remark that a tunnel of that magnitude should have taken 18 months to 2 years to construct. Its walls were reinforced when needed, with wooden paneling, and a generator pumped fresh air through a mile-long ventilation system to keep the tunnel oxygenated. On the ground, the tunnelers had laid down rails and used a motorcycle to shuttle 2 carts, which were filled with dirt back and forth along the shaft. Once El Chapo was reached, he would ride on that same motorcycle and quickly shuttle the mile distance to freedom. All that dirt, though, had to go somewhere, and so the tunnelers cleverly transferred it to the tunnel opening, where others would spread the dirt around on the field outside, rather than dump it in giant piles, which would no doubt draw attention. Still, the presence of fresh dirt littering acres of empty fields was sure to eventually draw attention, and questions that would not be easy to answer for the fake construction crew above ground. Suddenly though, in the middle of the night on July 12, 2015, the sound of metal scraping came from El Chapo's shower inside his cell. Moments later, the ceramic bottom of the shower popped free, and a friendly face greeted the imprisoned drug lord, beckoning him into the darkness below. Wasting no time, El Chapo ducked into the secret tunnel, climbing down 30 feet into a tunnel only as wide across as a man, but just tall enough for El Chapo to stand upright. Often derided for his short stature by his enemies, the tunnel diggers had made sure that the tunnel was just tall enough so the boss wouldn't have to hunch as he walked along it. A classy prison escape if we ever heard of one. A few feet into the mouth of the tunnel, El Chapo boarded a small motorcycle which had been affixed to metal tracks. The carts full of dirt that had pushed along for months now were gone, and just moments after leaving his cell, El Chapo was cruising along the well-lit tunnel like a kid on an amusement park ride. 2 minutes later, El Chapo ended his joyride by climbing up wooden steps and popping up into the empty shell of a home his crew had been secretly working from for a year and a half. Changing into clean clothes, El Chapo then climbed onto a truck and whisked away into the dark of the night, leaving behind an incredible mile-long secret tunnel and completely frustrated prison system and Mexican government both. El Chapo would be caught again just months after his escape, after his newest safe house was given away weeks before his arrival by careless gunmen who were spotted by locals. Responding to reports of heavily armed men, Mexican officials put the house under surveillance and intercepted communications saying that grandma or aunt was coming to visit. Realizing this had to be a high-value target, officials waited for their chance to strike. 1 month later, Mexican Special Forces soldiers raided the home and killed several bodyguards, but El Chapo and one of his most senior lieutenants escaped via, you guessed it, a secret tunnel. Popping up a mile from the home, the two stole a vehicle at gunpoint, though the driver immediately reported it to the police. After issuing an alert for the stolen vehicle, the federal police officers discovered the stolen car and placed the two fugitives under arrest. El Chapo, however, wouldn't go without at least trying to buy his freedom. Knowing how easily corruptible public officials had been in the past, El Chapo bribed the police officers, offering them money, homes, and even lucrative jobs if they let him go. Little did the desperate kingpin know, however, that he was dealing with a brand new brand of Mexican police officer, one not as easily corrupted as his predecessors. All 4 officers refused El Chapo, after which his offers of honey turned into vinegar, telling the police officers that they were all going to die. The 4 officers sent pictures to El Chapo to their superiors, only to be warned that the police had received a tip-off that 40 heavily armed assassins were en route to free El Chapo. With friendly forces still tied up at the compound, the officers were ordered to a nearby motel on the outskirts of town, where they holed themselves up in an empty room and prepared for a possible shootout for their lives. All the while, El Chapo laughed, echoing his previous threats. Suddenly, a convoy of vehicles lit up the roadside, clearly headed for the lonely motel. The officers, armed with M16 assault rifles and pistols, prepared for what was surely their last stand. El Chapo taunted them, telling them they were about to face death, and after them, their families. Yet the officers held their ground, ready to die for duty's sake if need be. As the vehicles began to turn into the parking lot, however, El Chapo's taunts died in his throat. Once the glare of the headlights faded, the barricaded officers could see military trucks full of Mexican Marines rushing to take up defensive positions around the motel. Minutes later, a thoroughly defeated and dejected-looking El Chapo was dragged into an SUV and rushed off to an airfield. El Chapo would not escape from Mexican prison again, and 2 years later, any hope of ever escaping again would be extinguished as Mexico approved an extradition request to the United States. Safely in U.S. custody, El Chapo faces life in prison, and though he may have been one of the deadliest men in Mexico's history, the drug kingpin would ultimately be remembered as nothing more than a sobbing mess as he begged U.S. justice officials for leniency, which they would not grant. It's the closing days of the Second World War, and despite defeat being a near certainty, the German army is still fighting ferociously, forcing Allied troops to pay for every inch of territory with their blood. Just outside the Vosges Mountains, an American infantry platoon is under heavy assault by a well-coordinated and armed German advance. Several M10 tank destroyers are lending their fire to the battle on the American side, but one by one they are hit by German Panzerschrecks and anti-tank munition, forcing their crews to abandon the vehicles. Amidst the chaos, one soldier sees that his men are about to be overrun, and he immediately orders them to make a break for the woods behind them. To cover their retreat, the soldier leaps up and rushes to a burning tank destroyer, hopping atop it and manning the 50 caliber machine gun, standing alone against a horde of oncoming Germans. Just 2 years earlier, Ali Murphy found himself being rejected for military service by first the Army and then the Navy and finally the Marine Corps. The 5'5" would-be soldier was too short and underweight, the military doctors all said. Plus, to boot, he was too young, only 16 years old. Yet there was a war on, and the pain of Pearl Harbor was still deeply felt by Murphy and most Americans. Plus, the US had just suffered crushing defeats in the Philippines. Murphy wanted to fight, and he wasn't going to stop trying to enlist until he was allowed to. Faking his birth certificate with the help of his sister, Murphy was finally accepted into the Army on the 30th of June, 1942. Taunted for his short stature, Murphy nonetheless immediately proved a very capable soldier, earning his marksman badge with rifle component bar and expert badge with bayonet component bar. Graduating from basic training, Murphy was sent overseas to the Mediterranean theater, acting as a platoon messenger in Algeria, while the Allies trained for their upcoming assault landings on Sicily. Weeks later, Murphy found himself on a speeding landing assault craft, plowing through the stormy seas with swells several feet high. A freak summer storm had sprung up overnight, preventing the landing of paratroopers meant to strike the German defenders from behind and ease the pressure on the landing sites. The weather was so bad, however, and the sea so violent that the German commanders relaxed their defenses, thinking no Allied commander would be insane enough to risk amphibious landings in such extreme wind and rain. Yet from out of the gloom and the howling wind, there suddenly came the thunderous booming of battleship batteries, raining death down amongst the German defensive positions. And just behind the fiery onslaught were lines of Allied landing craft, bringing 150,000 soldiers into the soft underbelly of Axis-held Europe. Murphy hit the beach with his men that day, and while on a scouting patrol came across 2 fleeing Italian officers, which he shot and killed. Having survived the violence of the initial landings though, a severe illness sidelined Murphy, and he was forced into a field hospital for a week. Rejoining his unit, he was then sent to Salerno, landing near Battipaglia, where he and 2 other soldiers were ambushed by a German unit. Their withering barrage immediately cut down one of the soldiers, leaving Murphy and another soldier alone against a squad of 5 Germans firing at them from a fortified position. Responding with hand grenades and their own machine gun fire, Murphy and his comrade killed all 5 Germans, sadly too late to save the injured soldier's life. 1 month later, Murphy joined in the assault against the Volturno Line. The southernmost line of German defenses meant to slow down the Allied assault into Italy. There, Murphy and his men repelled a counterattack by 7 German soldiers, killing 3 and taking 4 prisoners. For his leadership and excellence on the battlefield, Murphy received a promotion to sergeant, only to be promoted just 1 month later in January 1944 to staff sergeant, still only 19 years old. Hospitalized with malaria, Murphy was out of action for a week and a half before rejoining his men at the First Battle of Cisterna, a disastrous American defeat that saw the loss of over 700 U.S. Army Rangers. As U.S. forces licked their wounds, Murphy found himself taking shelter in an abandoned farmhouse along with his unit. Suddenly, a German panzer discovered their position, and Murphy crawled out alone on his belly, drawing close enough to destroy the tank with rifle grenades. For his incredible heroism, Murphy was awarded the Bronze Star with V device. Months later, Murphy found himself once more on a landing craft, being tossed around the choppy seas as he sped to shore on the south of France. The Normandy invasion had been successful, and Allied forces from a now defeated Italy would join in the retaking of France by catching the Germans between a northern and southern invasion, squeezing the Nazis back into Germany. Under heavy fire, the landing craft hit the beach, and men rushed forward to destroy the German defenders firing down on them from fortified bunkers. As the invasion force pushed out of the beaches, Murphy and his platoon found themselves picking their way through a beautiful French vineyard, a surreal moment of peace and calm amidst the incredible violence raging all around them. However, the peace was quickly shattered as German infantry opened fire on the Americans, wounding and killing several. Murphy's squad's machine gunner had been detached from the rest of his unit and desperately in need of some heavy suppressing fire. Murphy braved a storm of bullets to retrieve the weapon, and then incredibly rushed back into the fray and began returning fire, killing 2 German soldiers. Suddenly, the German fire slacked off and stopped, and 2 German soldiers left their position inside a house with their hands up, appearing to surrender. Murphy's best friend responded and approached the soldiers, ready to take them prisoner, when suddenly Germans hiding inside the house opened fire, killing him instantly. In a fit of rage, Murphy stormed the house completely alone as the Germans poured fire in his direction. Incredibly, Murphy avoided being hit and, armed with only his rifle, killed 6 Germans, wounded 2, and took 11 prisoner. For his and his men's heroism that day and in the following days, Murphy and his unit received the Presidential Unit Citation. Murphy's seemingly invulnerability, however, came to an end when on the 15th of September 1944, he was wounded by a mortar blast, shrapnel cutting deep into his heel. Just a few weeks later, though, Murphy was back in action and would earn a Silver Star for assaulting a German machine gun position, killing 4 and wounding 3. Just 3 days later, engaging the Germans at Leyte in the Clure River Valley, Murphy and his unit found themselves unable to take a heavily defended hill from their German defenders. Crawling alone forward toward the German position, where he could get a better vantage point, Murphy directed his men and their assault via radio, even while Germans rained machine gun and rifle fire down on him for over an hour. After successfully taking the hill, Murphy earned a bronze oak leaf cluster for his Silver Star and a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. Joining the assault into the heart of France, Murphy and his platoon were ambushed by German snipers on the 26th of October. Picking his way from cover to cover, Murphy managed to make his way right up to the German position, taking 2 of the soldiers prisoner, while suddenly a 3rd sniper shot him in the hip. Spinning on his attacker, Murphy leveled his rifle and put 1 round directly between the sniper's eyes. For his injury, Murphy received his first bronze oak leaf cluster for his Purple Heart, but partial loss of his hip muscle due to the removal of gangrene from the wound forced Murphy out of combat until January. By that time, though, the Allies were pushing the Germans steadily back and out of France. Joining his men at the Colmar Pocket in the Vosges Mountains near central France, Murphy and his men found themselves in the thick of some of the most brutal fighting of the war. Determined to force the Allies back into the sea, a fierce German counterattack broke on the U.S. lines like a storm. Caught out in the open, Murphy called for any fire support available to prevent the Germans overrunning their position. A detachment of M10 tank destroyers responded and immediately began engaging the Germans. However, German fire quickly began eliminating the vehicles one by one. Firing from a hastily prepared defensive position, the blast of a Panzerschreck striking an M10 just feet away rolled over Murphy. Knowing his men would be killed to the last if they remained out in the open, Murphy ordered his men to make a break for the woods behind them. Remaining at his position alone, he fired at the oncoming Germans while also directing artillery fire over the radio. Murphy knew he needed to lay down some heavy suppressing fire if his men were going to have any chance of making it to safety, but he was armed with only his M1 rifle. That's when Murphy spotted the 50 caliber machine gun atop the destroyed M10, and ignoring the flames, smoke, and incoming German fire all around him, Murphy made a mad dash for the burning wreck and crawled atop it, manning the heavy machine gun and laying down a withering barrage of fire at the oncoming Germans. For over an hour, Murphy stayed atop the burning vehicle, returning fire against the Germans and advancing vehicles. The mighty 50 caliber machine gun, nicknamed Ma Deuce by US forces, belched out high-speed death, shredding even the armor of the German vehicles. Wounded in both legs and finally out of ammunition after over 60 minutes of fighting, Murphy finally left the burning wreck and crawled his way back to his men in the woods behind him. Having killed and wounded 50 Germans and knocking out several German vehicles, Murphy ignored the wounds to his legs and led his men in an assault to repel the German counterattack, pushing the enemy back and securing the US position. On guard against a second counterattack, Murphy refused to be evacuated to a field hospital and remained with his men as his wounds were treated. For his heroism that day, Murphy was awarded the U.S. military's highest decoration, the Medal of Honor, given only in the most extreme cases of gallantry and heroism. His wounds proved to be too great to rejoin the fighting this time, however, and Murphy was moved from the front lines to regimental headquarters to act as an Army liaison officer, a well-deserved rest for an incredible soldier. Audie Murphy would ultimately become one of the most highly decorated soldiers in U.S. history, and even earned several awards and citations from the French and Belgian governments for heroism. Unable to continue service due to his injuries, Audie left the military at the end of the war and began a very successful career as a Hollywood actor, starring in several films featuring his own exploits in combat. Sadly, Murphy would go on to be killed in a plane crash on the 28th of May 1971, though his body would be interred in Arlington National Cemetery, where it remains one of the most visited graves. If there is one person the U.S. authorities do not want escaping from prison, it's the notorious Mexican drug kingpin, one Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. This man, from meager beginnings, the son of a farming family from Sinaloa, became an enemy number one of the United States, and a very rich man too. They have him locked up now, but El Chapo has escaped from prison before. Not once, but twice. So it goes without saying that right now he is guarded like no one else on the planet. Could this criminal Houdini get out again? Let's have a look. First, let's see how he managed to escape from prison the first time. In 1993, the LA Times ran the headline, "Mexico arrests reputed top drug kingpin." He was arrested in Guatemala, not far from the Mexican border. The charges against him were murder, kidnapping, and of course, drug trafficking. The authorities said he was behind a huge trafficking operation in a massive tunnel that ran from Tijuana to San Diego, where drugs were carried through. Digging tunnels, as you'll see, was something of a forte for Guzman and his crew. He was extradited to Mexico and got 20 years 9 months to be served in a maximum security prison. There, it said he controlled the place and lived in comfort, with the guards doing what he told them to do. While he could easily run his operations from there, as time went by, he feared extradition to the US. It was time to go. It was January 19, 2001 when he made the first escape. A prison guard named Francisco El Chito Cambreros Rivera opened the electronic door to his cell when Guzman hid himself in a laundry basket. He was pushed through a series of doors and eventually got out of the main door. From there, he was taken in the trunk of a car to a designated spot, and when the time was right, he took off into the night. Like that, he was gone. It might sound too easy, but it was found out that he not only had guards on his payroll, but also the prison director. Even the cops were paid to make his getaway into the night that much easier. It turned out to be a bit of an embarrassment for the Mexican authorities. All the bribes Guzman paid added up to around $2.5 million. So this could never happen again, right? Wrong. He kept on doing what he did and became Mexico's most wanted man. But despite that, he managed to evade capture. Then on the 22nd of February 2014, after an operation between Mexican and US authorities, he was captured again. They had him, and they thought that was it. He was not going to bribe his way out of prison this time. When being moved around, he was surrounded by the military and the police. Even the A-team couldn't have made the plan come together to extricate this guy from the arms of the law. This time, he was locked up in a very restricted area. His cell had no windows and he had little contact with anyone. He had a Spartan cell and this time no luxuries. A bed, a shelf, a shower, a toilet bowl, and a basin. That's what he got. He was allowed some visits and he had the right to receive the maximum amount of money to buy hygiene products. That was about $48 US. Not so much for the man who had millions. He could take an hour out of his cell a day, but the guards were told not to communicate with him. How on earth could he escape a second time then? Well, on the 11th of July 2015, he did just that. You see, there was a blind spot for the security cameras, and that was where the shower was. At close to 9 p.m. that night, he was seen going to that part of the cell, and that's where he vanished. Prior to that, for months, El Chapo's men had been digging a tunnel, and the end point was at that shower cell. The digging had been so noisy at times, some of the other inmates had complained about strange noises. El Chapo's wife, Emma Coronel, played a big part in orchestrating the escape. El Chapo had land not far from the prison where the digging began, and he had even managed to get a smartwatch smuggled into his cell so the diggers knew the coordinates. This was some escape, and the tunnel even had ventilation and lighting. To get out fast, El Chapo used a motorbike, but it was especially made to run on rails. This contraption was also used for the excavation process. Authorities later said the tunnel was 0.93 miles long, 5 feet 7 inches high, and 30 inches in width. It was 33 feet underground, and so El Chapo used a ladder to get down there. He was a free man, but his freedom didn't last very long. After an armed raid at a residence on the 8th of January 2016, Guzman managed to get away, once again using tunnels. He was captured shortly after though. Now, the USA wanted him again, and the proceedings got in the way to extradite him. Guzman's men tried anything to prevent this from happening, and even assassinated a federal judge. It didn't work. He was finally extradited on January 9, 2017 to the USA, exactly 18 years after this first prison escape. Right after his sentencing, in which he received life in prison plus 30 years, he just disappeared. That's because on his way to prison, the safest bet was to take him to an undisclosed location. Even Guzman's lawyers didn't know where he was. It was later revealed that he ended up at what's called America's highest security prison. That is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. It's known in short as ADX Florence. This is where the worst of the worst go. In prison terms, it's the end of the road. There are way more guards here to the number of inmates than at other prisons. Inmates are locked up 23 hours a day. When they are allowed out, it may come at any time, day or night. So even if somehow a plan could be devised by the people on the outside, they wouldn't know when their guy was out of his cell. The 7 by 12 feet cell has a bed, a stool, and a desk all made of poured concrete. The cells are soundproofed so prisoners can't shout and communicate with each other. The inmates never know where they are in the facility because they never see through a window that will allow them to guess their location. Even when they can exercise, it is not a yard, but an empty swimming pool, so they can't see over the walls. It's not a big one either, and it only takes 10 steps to walk from end to end. All over the prison there are motion detectors and cameras, and the thick steel doors can only be opened with remote control. Officers monitor all parts of the prison from a control room, and if anything strange should happen, they can hit a panic button which will automatically lock every door in the prison. The prison also has pressure pads, so an alert is sent if someone should stand on one of those pads. If someone could somehow get past the pressure pads and the cameras and get outside, they would have to scale a 12-foot tall razor wire fence, and they'd have to do that in front of heavily armed guards in one of the many towers. Other guards will walk around with attack dogs. It's very likely that Guzman is also in the most secure unit of this ultra-secure prison, which is called Range 13. By the way, guards at this prison are vetted to prevent anyone corrupt getting a job. While working, they're told to communicate with the prisoners as little as possible. It's escape-proof is what most people say, and it's not a nice place to end up. A former warden once described it like this: "This supermax is life after death. It's long-term. In my opinion, it's far much worse than death." Others have said how eerily quiet the place is because no two inmates move at the same time. It's very clean. Everything is spotless. So when journalists have gone in, they've been very surprised. It might look as bright as heaven if it weren't hell. In fact, that's how one warden described it, like a clean version of hell. He told 60 Minutes, "I don't know what hell is, but I do know the assumption would be for a free person, it's pretty close to it." This is how one inmate described it. "The purpose is to gradually tear a person down mentally and physically through environmental and physical deprivation. For an inmate, it's kind of like having the place to yourself." Some people have said, because it's like this, the only way a person could escape would be if they actually had the prison warden in their pocket, which is never going to happen. There are only around 400 inmates, some of whom include Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma City bomber. Just to get near the place, you'd be spotted, and Guzman can forget about buying land near it. This prison is in a remote location. There's not much for miles around. Guzman has visitors, but only his lawyer and his 2 daughters have been allowed to see him. He cannot actually touch anyone who visits him. He's told his lawyer because of the oppressive conditions, he regularly throws up, has headaches, and also sinus trouble. He said it's also very hard to sleep because the lights are on all the time. If prisoners do want to break from the monotony, they at least have a TV, but that only plays religious and educational programs. This is how another person who's retired from the prison described this place. Supermax is austere, and it's run with absolute structure and security in mind. From an operational perspective, it's the most secure prison on Earth. But if the man known as Papillon escaped from the notorious Devil's Island penal colony, and if those 3 guys really did escape from Alcatraz, maybe no prison on Earth is 100% secure. Just about anyone in the corrections business would disagree, but maybe El Chapo could get out of this one. What are the chances of Mr. Guzman escaping from the place nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies? Let's think about it. If he were to get out of his cell, maybe he'd have to do that by bribing a guard. But they've been vetted. Perhaps the only way a guard would offer him help would be because Guzman's men had kidnapped his family. But as only one man moves at a time, that prisoner is being watched from the control room. We just don't think he could go out the front door. He certainly couldn't get past those pressure pads, and the guards in the towers, and the guards with the dogs, and over a massive fence that would cut him to pieces. All the time, everything is caught on CCTV. He would need a small army on the outside, and since the location is in the middle of nowhere, that army would be seen. Even if he employed some great hacker to hack the prison system and open the doors, he'd still have to face heavily armed guards. We can't see this happening outside of a Hollywood movie. But prisoners do have rights to see medical professionals, never mind how secure they are. This is the US law, so perhaps an escape could be made if El Chapo had to make a trip to a hospital. Possibly a catastrophic event, such as an earthquake or a fire, could result in an escape. But this is pretty unlikely. If prisoners were suddenly removed from their cells, they'd be shackled, so they wouldn't get anywhere fast. In conclusion, we think El Chapo will not be going anywhere. This prison is a techno fortress that no man could escape from. The only scenario that he gets out in is a screenplay which involves an apocalyptic event shutting down all the systems and the guards being eaten by monsters, after which El Chapo sneaks out the back door and begins a mission of survival. He'll be doing no digging out of prison this time, and no one will be holding out their hand and accepting a bribe. A soldier carefully walks through the dense jungles of Vietnam. Suddenly, he stumbles across a hidden tripwire, and with a sudden swoosh, a massive mace made out of bamboo and fitted with spikes comes swinging down out of the tree cover, smashing into his chest. Next to him, his buddy makes one false step, and after a slight click, an explosion rips his foot and most of his lower leg off. This is the hell that was the most terrifying booby traps of the Vietnam War. A booby trap, simply known as the mace, was not only terrifying but deadly upon impact. As US soldiers walked along jungle paths making their way to their next objective, they could be ambushed from above. The mace was a large ball made of wood or metal covered in spikes, secured in the jungle's trees. The spikes were made out of bamboo, branches, or even metal. The mace would be secured in the tree and tied to a tripwire. When an unsuspecting soldier snagged his boot on the wire, it would trigger the release of the spiked ball, which would swing down from the trees and impale itself into the soldier's skull. This would most likely cause immediate death, but if it did not, the soldier would wish he were dead. There would be no way for the spikes to be pulled out without killing the wounded soldier, so the mace either caused death upon impact or soon after. A simpler version of the mace could be constructed using materials found only in the jungle. This made the mace a versatile booby trap. Viet Cong soldiers could sharpen bamboo into pointed stakes, then stick them through a large ball of mud. When left in the sun, the mud would harden and secure the bamboo spikes in place. Then the Viet Cong could tie the mace to a tree using vines or cords. All of this could be done by a single soldier and then left alone until an unsuspecting victim triggered it. The ability to construct booby traps out of the jungle itself became a common theme with the Viet Cong, and each booby trap they created was more terrifying than the next. One of the most well-known booby traps used by the Viet Cong were punji sticks. These were sharpened bamboo stakes that were placed in a camouflaged hole. If a soldier fell into the pit, they would be impaled on the stakes. It was a truly horrible trap, but was super effective. The thick jungles of Vietnam allowed this booby trap to be set almost anywhere and easily disguised. The way it worked was the Viet Cong soldiers would dig a hole deep enough and place the sharpened punji sticks face up. Then they would weave a bunch of branches and leaves together to make a false ground. This would be placed over the hole to disguise it as debris that had fallen onto a path. The hole would be almost impossible to see, but if a soldier stepped on the disguised canopy, they would instantly fall into the pit and impale themselves on the sharpened bamboo. However, this booby trap could be made even worse by a few gross additions. Some punji sticks were lined with regular sharpened bamboo, while others had spikes covered in human feces or animal waste. This would increase the chances of infection if a soldier was cut open by one of the sticks, but did not die. In the jungle, an open wound would not stay clean for long, and since it was rare that a platoon would carry antibiotics, it would most likely get infected, causing the soldier to become very ill. This is because the humidity and the temperature are the perfect environment for bacteria to breed and cause mayhem in the body. If you add a biological component such as fecal matter or waste to the wound, it almost always guaranteed an infection will develop. This would slow down entire squads as they tried to carry their wounded back to base, making them easier targets for ambush. So it would seem the Viet Cong were not only using the punji sticks as booby traps, but as a form of biological warfare as well. And if that wasn't terrifying enough, there was another awful way in which the punji sticks were being used. The punji sticks could be cut and placed in a way that made them more like barbs than spears. Sometimes they'd be placed upside down so the soldier who fell in wouldn't necessarily get hurt too bad when they fell into the pit, but as they tried to climb out, the punji sticks would tear through their flesh, opening multiple wounds. As the unlucky soldier either tried to claw their way out of the pit or were pulled up by their squad mates, it would be almost inevitable that one of the punji sticks would pierce their skin. This is when covering the points in bacteria-laden waste would cause the most damage. It would almost be worse to be wounded rather than die by being impaled. By slowly succumbing to infection, the screams of the wounded soldier would not only give the squad's location away, but the slower pace would make the grueling trek through the jungle even more perilous. But there is a worse pit to fall into than one filled with punji sticks. An unlucky soldier that stepped in the wrong place might find themselves in the bottom of a pit filled with venomous snakes. In the words of Indiana Jones, snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? This would be on the mind of any soldier who fell into a hidden viper pit. The hole itself would be camouflaged in a way similar to punji sticks booby traps, but instead of sharpened bamboo in the bottom of the hole, there would be hundreds of snakes. When the soldier fell in, he would disturb the already hungry and disgruntled snakes, causing them to attack immediately. As he writhed around covered in the vipers, the soldier would receive bite after bite filled with venom. And these weren't just ordinary snakes, they were bamboo pit vipers. These snakes may not have been very big, but their venom is deadly. A single bite from one of these snakes could kill a healthy, full-grown adult within minutes, and they were actually nicknamed the two-step snake by the soldiers. This was because the venom of a bite from a bamboo pit viper would cause a soldier to collapse after only taking 2 more steps. And if there were any baby snakes in the hole, the pit became even more deadly. Young snakes still produce venom, but they can't control how much is released with a single bite. This means when bit by a baby viper, they release their entire venom payload into the victim, making them even more deadly than the adults. Regardless of age of the snakes in the pits, there would always be a lot of them. Any soldier who fell in would be repeatedly bit and had 0 chance of making it back to base alive. The vipers were not only used by the Viet Cong in camouflaged pits, but in many other types of booby traps as well. In fact, the vipers were a natural booby trap that was plentiful in the jungle. The Viet Cong soldiers would often carry a pit viper in their packs. This was a way to booby trap their own supplies if they were killed or captured by the enemy. It also served as a deterrent from anyone going through their supplies without permission. If a United States soldier came across a Viet Cong pack, they would open it to see if anything was useful inside. However, if it was booby-trapped with a bamboo pit viper, the soldier might be bitten as they reached into the pack to see what it contained. This was a deterrent, but if the Viet Cong soldier got lucky, the snake could kill anyone trying to steal their supplies as well. The pit viper was also used to booby-trap the tunnels that the Viet Cong used as a means to get around and stay hidden. As US soldiers crawled through the tunnels looking for any enemy soldiers, they might come across these deadly snakes tied to sticks or placed in the holes in the wall. Crawling through the dark tunnel complexes was scary enough, but not knowing if there were venomous snakes set as booby traps throughout them must have been terrifying. A soldier that was focused on what was ahead of them might miss a pit viper on the ground or hanging from the tunnel ceiling. One wrong step by the US soldier could mean a fatal bite, causing him to collapse and die in the blackness of the Viet Cong tunnels. Snakes were used to booby-trap pretty much anything that could have been valuable to the enemy. They were hidden in weapons caches, food stores, and supply crates. Basically, if a US soldier found a Viet Cong supply stash, they needed to proceed with caution and assume it was booby-trapped in some way. Snakes were not the only terrifying booby trap used to deter US soldiers from going through Viet Cong supplies, though. Others included sharp blades, rigged explosives, and live ammunition. These types of booby traps came to be known as keepsake lose hand traps. If a soldier was going to go rummaging through the stash of Viet Cong supplies or personal items, there was a good chance they would encounter a booby trap of some kind. So if a soldier stuck their hand into something to try to remove a keepsake, they might lose their hand to one of these next crazy booby traps. A seemingly innocent supply stash was often rigged with explosives. This was done to deter US soldiers from taking military supplies, food, and anything that would help them defeat the Viet Cong in the war. It was better for supplies to be blown up than fall into enemy hands. Viet Cong supply caches would have grenades wedged in them, so if a soldier started moving things around, the pin would be pulled out and the grenade would detonate. These traps were often lethal, but like the punji sticks, if the grenade maimed or seriously injured a soldier, it could actually be worse. Pieces of shrapnel could be shot in every direction, wounding multiple targets at once and making the entire platoon vulnerable to counterattack. The chances of surviving a grenade at close proximity were not good. But the chances of surviving a serious injury without putting the rest of your squad mates in danger was even worse. A favorite type of Viet Cong booby trap actually had nothing to do with useful supplies at all, but with flags. The Viet Cong figured out early on that when the United States soldiers secured a base or outpost, they would just take down the VC flag that was currently flying there. Sometimes this was just to replace the flag with an American one, so the Allies knew the outpost was under their control. Other times, soldiers would keep the flag as memorabilia. This led to the Viet Cong booby-trapping their flags with bombs. Flag bombs went something like this. The Viet Cong would realize they could no longer hold a base, so they quickly grabbed everything they could and made a run for it. But while others were gathering supplies, some soldiers were tasked with booby-trapping parts of the base. They would hide grenades in the pit vipers and supply caches. Sometimes they would rig entire ammunition stores to explode. The final thing to be done before abandoning the base would be to plant the flag bomb. A Viet Cong soldier would connect a nearly invisible wire to the pulley system on the flagpole and bury an explosive at the base. Then they would retreat into the jungle and head to their next objective. Eventually, the US soldiers would enter the abandoned base and search for anything of use. Someone would be in charge of bringing down the enemy flag, so it was clear the base was captured. Unfortunately for that unlucky soldier, when they pulled the drawstring to lower the flag, the explosive would be triggered and detonate right under their feet. A modified version of this booby trap was also used in the jungle itself, making walking down paths or following a Viet Cong party extremely dangerous. The US soldiers needed to watch every step they took, or it could be their last. A common booby trap that every soldier needed to be wary of was the grenade in a can. This was simple but a deadly trap that could be deployed anywhere and at any time. The way a grenade in a can worked was that two empty metal cans would be wedged into the ground or mounted in the trees along a path. The safety pins of both grenades would be removed. Then the live grenades would be stuffed into the cans, making sure the striker levers remained in place until the grenades were pulled out. After each can and grenade was secured, a tripwire would be tied to each end of the grenade. When the enemy soldier stepped on or pulled the wire with their boot, the grenades would be torn out of the cans and instantly explode. Even if only one grenade was pulled out, the detonation would most likely cause the second one to explode. Having two grenades go off along a path with multiple soldiers walking down it would be devastating. The soldier that tripped the booby trap would not be the only one in the kill zone. Instead, the entire squad could be in jeopardy. Sharp pieces of metal from the can and the grenade would mix with razor-sharp splinters of wood from the surrounding vegetation. If a soldier tripped a grenade in a can before being able to alert the rest of their squad, it could be deadly for almost everyone in the area. The traps were super simple, yet extremely effective, making their proliferation across the Vietnam jungle widespread. The saddest part of it all is that there was no way to know where all of the grenade in a can booby traps were set after the war ended. This meant that innocent Vietnamese people, including women and children, who traveled the jungle paths to get back to their homes, could inadvertently trip one of the booby traps. This could cause a massive amount of pain and suffering even after the war was long over. Another dangerous booby trap was not quite as deadly as the grenade in a can, however, it could still cause a lot of pain and even the loss of a foot. These traps were known as cartridge traps or toe poppers. The way they worked was truly diabolical. A small hole would be dug by a Viet Cong soldier, a round of ammunition would be placed in a piece of bamboo, and then carefully lowered into the hole. At the base of the bamboo would be a piece of wood with a nail sticking out of it. The hole would then be concealed with a very thin covering and left for someone to step on. When a soldier put their boot down on the booby trap, their weight would push the cartridge down and the nail would pierce the bottom of the bullet. This would cause the round to fire straight up, blowing a hole through the soldier's foot. The soldier would be incapacitated and their squad mates would need to rush to help them. The cartridge trap was usually not lethal but would definitely stop a squad in its tracks until the wounded soldier could be bandaged up. However, sometimes larger cartridges were used. They could be so powerful that an unlucky soldier with his entire body over the cartridge trap could have the bullet exit through his foot and tear into other parts of his body. And heaven forbid the soldier was looking down at the time and got the bullet straight to the face. This would obviously be a lethal scenario. What made the cartridge trap so effective is that it was almost impossible to detect. The hole the bamboo and ammunition were placed into was not very big, and since there was no wires involved, there was nothing on the surface to indicate that a booby trap was present there. Unless a squad had someone with a metal detector, a cartridge trap would most likely go unnoticed until it went off. And even if a soldier did have a metal detector due to the size of the trap, they would need to be relatively close to it before it would be detectable, and by then it may have been too late. A booby trap which was truly terrible could not be prevented by using a metal detector or any other method other than springing the trap itself or getting really lucky. A booby trap known as a bamboo whip could be made anywhere in the jungles of Vietnam using only things found in nature. This trap was constructed by finding a long, thin piece of bamboo and cutting it down. Then smaller pieces of bamboo would be chopped up and sharpened. If there was no rope available, the sharpened bamboo stakes could be secured to the long piece of bamboo using cordage or vines. The spiked bamboo whip would be secured to a tree on the side of a path or an area with heavy U.S. traffic. It would be pulled back into the jungle, which would create tension that, when released, would cause the bamboo whip to swing forward at lightning speed and strike whatever was in its path with enormous force. Bamboo is not only versatile but incredibly strong. It can withstand large amounts of pressure before snapping, which means a ton of stored energy can be maintained for a long period of time before being released. The pulled-back bamboo whip would then be secured using a tripwire. Again, if the Viet Cong only had materials of the jungle available to them, the tripwire could also be made out of vines. When U.S. soldiers walked down the path and someone tripped the whip, the long piece of bamboo would swing forward and the sharpened spikes would impale themselves into the body of the unlucky soldier who was in the front. The bamboo whip could be positioned at different heights as well. The Viet Cong could rig it so that when the spikes came around, they slammed into someone's shins or upper thighs. This would not be deadly, but the amount of time and effort it would take to remove each stake from the soldier's legs without having him bleed to death would be tedious. Also, the tips of the stakes could be covered in biological waste like the punji sticks, causing almost immediate infection and eventual death. But the bamboo whip could also be elevated, meaning that when it swung around, it could impale itself into a soldier's stomach or chest. This would cause almost immediate death if it struck a vital organ. Or if it just pierced an organ, the soldier could be in excruciating pain until he eventually succumbed to internal bleeding. A much rarer situation due to accuracy limitations would be that the bamboo whip was placed at neck and head height. If placed at the correct position when the bamboo whip was released, the spikes could enter the neck, causing the soldier to choke on his own blood. It could also enter the face or eye sockets, leading to immediate death as the spike entered the brain. The Viet Cong were also good at using the United States' own weapons against them when improvising some booby traps. If the Viet Cong came across a US mine, they would not destroy it but repurpose it into a booby trap. They would dig it up and place the mine somewhere else, hoping that an enemy soldier would step on it or a vehicle would drive over it. However, these were not the only source of mines at their disposal. The region had been at war for several decades in one way or another. The Viet Cong had gathered up explosives from the South Vietnamese army and older French mines that were left lying around after the First Indochina War. And if those sources of mines weren't enough, the Viet Cong were also supplied with ordnances from the Soviet Union and China. This meant that there was almost an endless supply of these deadly booby traps that the Viet Cong could place around the country. Unfortunately, all these mines came with future consequences. Like many other types of booby traps, many were left over or forgotten after the end of the Vietnam War. There are places even today where people need to be careful where they step. in case there's a hidden landmine lurking just under the soil. Approximately 40,000 Vietnamese people have died from landmine explosions since the war's end. Another somewhat ingenious booby trap is reminiscent of something out of the medieval times, except the Viet Cong version had a slight twist. The bow trap looked like a wooden crossbow. This was another one of the booby traps that could be constructed using only materials found in the jungle. This particular device was mostly used at the beginning of the war, as it took a while to build and was not as effective as other booby traps. However, the bow trap could cause all sorts of problems for a United States platoon if they were not careful. The bow was created out of a straightened branch and some rope. A stick would be whittled down to a fine point, and the whole setup would be placed on a stand. The string would then be drawn back and tied to a tripwire. The entire bow could be covered in brush, and since the bow was made out of materials from the jungle, it would blend right in. When a US soldier tripped the wire, the arrow would be released and sunk itself into their body. This was obviously excruciating, and if there were multiple bows set up in the same area, they could lead to several casualties. However, the Viet Cong took things a step further with these booby traps by adding poison to the tips of the arrows. Most of the bow traps were set up to be aimed at the midsection of the body. This allowed for the greatest chance of hitting the target and delivering a fatal dose of pit viper venom and other toxins. The Viet Cong seemed to favor some booby traps over others. This was especially true due to the variety in these next types of traps. Foot traps came in all shapes and sizes in the Vietnam War. Sometimes the Viet Cong would use a metal bear trap that would snap its jaws shut on the ankle of a US soldier who wasn't paying attention. However, the bear traps were limited in supply and could be found easily using metal detectors. Therefore, the Viet Cong began to design their own foot traps. Some of the foot traps were as simple as digging a hole in the ground and lining the sides with sharpened sticks or nails. When a US soldier's foot fell in, the entire leg would be shredded to pieces. Other foot traps used a series of wooden blocks that were embedded with spikes. These worked similarly to bear traps, except they were used creating wood and pointy objects that the Viet Cong had available. The jungle wasn't the only place that contained hazards set up by the Viet Cong. Even when entering huts and buildings, US soldiers needed to be careful. The door trap was easy to make and incredibly deadly. A decent-sized stick with spikes could be suspended above a doorway and tied in place using a tripwire. When a soldier walked through the opening, they would pull the wire, causing the wooden stakes to swing down and slam into their chest. The force at which the door trap was able to send the sharpened wood spikes into a soldier's body made it incredibly deadly. The downside for the Viet Cong was that this trap could only be sprung once, and there would only be one casualty, but it definitely made the US soldiers think twice before entering a building. Booby traps were highly effective at slowing down, killing, or deterring United States soldiers, which was one of the main reasons they were used so often by the Viet Cong. They knew they would never win the war using traditional tactics. The United States military had more advanced ships, aircraft, and vehicles. This meant that the Viet Cong would lose almost every battle they fought if they went head-to-head with a heavily armed US force. They discovered this quickly and almost immediately switched tactics. Women and young children were also used to deploy different kinds of booby traps. This allowed for large areas to be covered in booby traps while the soldiers were deployed in different regions. Every able-bodied person could help in the war effort. Didn't matter who you were, if you could carve a stick and tie some string, you could make a booby trap that would hurt the enemy. According to the Australian Ministry of Defence, around 11% of all deaths and 15% of injuries in the Vietnam War were due to booby traps. The number of US soldiers wounded during the war was around 300,000 men, which means that about 45,000 Americans were injured by the terrifying booby traps of the Viet Cong.
For many, the thought of prison is enough to keep them on the straight and narrow. But for others, prison is merely a consequence of their chosen lifestyle. And for a select few, prison is nothing more than a challenge, a puzzle begging to be solved. Today, we'll look at some of the more creative escapes in this episode of the Infographics show, The Greatest Prison Escapes in History. We're starting off with a classic, fictionalized by Hollywood into the film The Great Escape starring Steve McQueen, though the real story is fraught with far more drama than what could fit on the silver screen. In World War II, the prisoner of war camp known as Stalag Luft III was thought to be the most secure POW camp in Europe. Hundreds of miles southeast of Berlin, it was located deep in enemy territory and featured a host of security features meant to make it difficult to escape from. Along with barbed wire fences, the Germans had sunk microphones 9 feet deep into the soil all along the perimeter in order to detect the sound of digging. The prisoners' huts were all built on stilts, raised up above the ground so any tunnel would be immediately visible. Lastly, the sandy soil made it nearly impossible to dig through, threatening collapse at any moment. Yet none of these things stopped a band of British, Canadian, Australian, French, and American airmen from attempting an escape anyways. The plan was to build 3 tunnels codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. Using only metal silverware and milk tin cans, the prisoners painstakingly chipped away at the building support columns of 3 different huts in order to avoid being seen working underneath them. They accessed their below-floor workspace via a secret trapdoor over which they kept a heating stove permanently lit in order to discourage any Nazi guards from getting too close. In order to solve the microphone problem, the escapees dug their tunnels a whopping 30 feet deep, excavating an astonishing 100 tons of sand, all by hand. To avoid raising suspicion, the excavated sand was concealed in stuffed socks which they would sprinkle discreetly on garden soil being raked by other prisoners. To shore up their tunnel walls, the prisoners stripped 4,000 wooden bedboards and then lined each tunnel with 1,700 blankets to muffle the sounds of digging. They converted discarded milk tins into lamps with wicks made from pajama cords, and burned in mutton fat the prisoners skimmed off the greasy soup they were served. Stealing a few hundred feet of electrical wire, the prisoners even managed to fashion their own work lights, which they plugged directly into the camp's electrical supply. And if that's not enough ingenuity, the prisoners also created an air pump using hockey sticks and other discarded bits of trash, and even built an underground trolley system to transport the excavated sand. On March 24, 1944, the prisoners finally made their escape. Forced to move one by one through the cramped tunnels, barely a dozen managed to make it out per hour, and at one point, a 1-hour blackout during an air raid further slowed the escape attempt. At around 5 a.m., however, disaster struck, with a Nazi guard on patrol nearly falling into the exit shaft of one of the 3 tunnels and discovering the plot. A massive manhunt was mobilized, and eventually the Germans recovered 73 of the 76 escapees. 3, however, would make it to safety. 2 Norwegians, who stowed away on a freighter to Sweden, and a Dutchman who made his way to Gibraltar by rail and foot. A furious Hitler ordered the execution of 50 of the escapees, violating the Geneva Convention. Years after the war, a military tribunal found 18 Nazi soldiers guilty of war crimes for shooting the recaptured POWs, and 13 of them were executed. As one of the largest manhunts in American history, the prison escape of the Texas 7 in December of 2000 made headlines around the world. On December 13, 2000, the 7 inmates convinced a maintenance supervisor to let them skip lunch so they could wax the floors of the maintenance room. Distracting the supervisor, one of the inmates knocked him unconscious with a blow to the back of the head, then undressed him, tied him up, and locked him in an electrical room. During this time, 3 other inmates, 4 prison guards, and 9 supervisors wandered into the room, and incredibly, all were subdued by the inmates. That's when the Texas 7 put their plan into action. By impersonating various supervisors over the telephone, the inmates got out of 12 head counts, and then making their way to the gatehouse, incredibly conned their way inside by pretending to be monitor installers. Once inside the gatehouse, the prisoners subdued the lone guard and got his firearm along with a few other weapons from a weapons cache. Then the prisoners opened the back gate and drove their way out in a stolen pickup truck, launching a multi-state manhunt that would be one of the largest in American history. Eventually found, thanks in part to the television program America's Most Wanted, the prisoners even demanded a TV appearance before they would agree to surrender. In the end, no such appearance would be granted, and all of the 7 were brought back into custody. There's never been a more iconic prison in history than Alcatraz, and naturally it is the setting for our greatest prison escape story. A lifelong criminal, Frank Morris was serving a 10-year stint for bank robbery when he broke out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, only to be recaptured a year later and sent to Alcatraz. Ranked in the top 2% of the population in intelligence and with an IQ of 133, Morris paid no heed to Alcatraz's reputation as an inescapable prison and quickly went to work developing an escape plan. Partnering with brothers John and Clarence Anglin and car thief Alan West, the 4 prisoners discovered an unguarded utility corridor that ran just behind their cells, which housed a ventilation shaft to the roof. Utilizing scavenged saw blades, spoons stolen from the commissary, and even a home-built drill made from the motor of a broken vacuum cleaner, the 4 gradually widened the ventilation duct opening in each of their cells. The holes were concealed using cardboard and paint, and Morris's accordion provided cover for the sound of their work. Once inside the utility corridor, the four climbed to the roof of their cell block and set up a small workshop there. Using stolen and donated materials, the four made makeshift life preservers using 50 raincoats from a design they had seen in an issue of Popular Mechanics. They also used the raincoats to create a 6 by 14-foot rubber raft and used a small accordion-like concertina they stole from another inmate as a bellows to inflate the raft. Their paddles were made from scrap wood and stolen screws. On the night of June 11, 1962, the men began their escape. Of the four, though, Alan West was unable to leave his cell, having used cement to shore up the crumbling concrete around the vent opening in his cell, which threatened to give him away. Once dried, the cement narrowed the escape hole and fixed the steel grill in place, and by the time he had re-widened his hole and removed the grill, the others had already left without him. The other three inmates climbed the ventilation shaft to the roof, then hauled their homemade life preservers and raft 50 feet down a kitchen vent pipe to the ground, and then scaled two 12-foot barbed wire fences. Somewhere along the northeast shoreline of Alcatraz, where the prison's network of searchlights and gun towers had a blind spot, the men inflated their raft and then rode into the dense fog, trying to reach Angel Island 2 miles to the north. In the ensuing manhunt, police would recover one of the paddles and bits of raft and life preservers, but no sign of the men. With their stated plan having been to steal clothing in a car and no vehicle or clothing thefts reported in the area after the escape, the police finally concluded that in all likelihood, the men drowned in the strong currents and frigid waters of San Francisco Bay.
March 5, 1944, the Burmese jungle, U.S. Army 849th Engineer Aviation Battalion Camp. "Get back!" yelled 21-year-old Private Herman Perry. He stood in the road brandishing his M1 Garand rifle. Lieutenant Cady ignored the warning and stepped closer. Sweating, sobbing, probably coming off an opium high, Perry was losing it, having a breakdown. He wasn't going to let Cady take him into custody. He wasn't going to do more time at the parasite-infested hellhole known as the Leyte Stockade. Despite Perry's erratic behavior, Cady wasn't about to back off. This boy had a smart mouth. He'd been AWOL. He was a troublemaker. He needed to be punished. Besides, there was no way that Perry would shoot. That would be suicidal. Now less than a foot away from Perry, Cady stretched out a hand toward him. Bam! Cady jerked and crumpled to the ground. For a split second, everyone stared in disbelief at the fatally wounded Cady. Then Perry swung his gun around and trained it on the other officers as he backed away down the road. As he neared the trees, he turned and ran, vanishing into the brush. During World War II, the United States segregated its armed forces. Sure, there were a couple of African-American combat units created mainly for political reasons, but the majority of African Americans who served were relegated to menial tasks, including cooking, cleaning, and construction. That's how close to 10,000 African Americans ended up being shipped to Burma. These men are stationed there to build what will end up being a boondoggle, a 1,072-mile supply road to run through the Burmese jungle connecting Leyte, India to Kunming, China. Some 5,000 white Americans are also sent to work on the Leyte Road. However, many of them are officers overseeing the black soldiers. The Burmese jungle is torturous. It's hot, humid, the vegetation's dense, the terrain is rough, it's easy to get malaria or dysentery, and it's hard to avoid the leeches, lice, and mosquitoes. Even worse, sometimes man-eating tigers lurk in the brush, clothes rot, and the food rations are poor. Building the Leyte Road is back-breaking, far harder than Perry's North Carolinian childhood of picking cotton in a sharecropping family. The soldiers have mandatory 16-hour shifts. Bulldozers supplied by the Army quickly break down, and the GIs are forced into manual labor. They use hoes and pickaxes to dig the muddy, rocky red soil. Many of the black soldiers work side by side and become friendly with coolies, unskilled native laborers. As a result, the black soldiers pick up bush lingo, Urdu, and Hindi. They trade in the local black markets for moonshine known as jungle juice. Some soldiers, including Perry, seek solace from the grim drudgery of their lives in opium and marijuana. When Cady was attempting to take him into custody, Perry was coming off a 2-day drug bender. After shooting Cady, a panicked Perry runs into the jungle. Oh God, he killed someone. For 3 days, Perry stumbles through the jungle in a daze. Not knowing what to do, he veers back to the Leyte Road. He runs into some soldiers from a different unit working on the road. They feed him and pass along messages from his friends in the 849th Battalion. Military police are looking for him. Perry decides to surrender. At nightfall, he stands by a bridge for the Namyong River. Sooner or later, a patrol will come by and he'll turn himself in. While waiting, Perry sits down his rifle. Hearing gunshots somewhere nearby, Perry gets worried the MPs are gunning for him and they'll kill him outright instead of arresting him. Spooked, he slips into the jungle again, accidentally leaving his gun behind. Perry spends several days wandering in the jungle. Luckily, he speaks some bush lingo, which allows him to beg for rice from Naga farmers. The Naga are an ethnic group native to northeastern India and northwestern Burma. Some of the tribes live remotely and stick to traditional practices, including headhunting. For the most part, the British and Americans ignore the Naga as long as they stick to making war on each other and not Westerners. March 18th. Around 2 weeks after he'd killed Katie and fled into the jungle, Perry runs into some British troops. Perry, who's always been a smooth talker, thinks fast and makes up excuses as to why he's alone in the jungle. He's able to charm the Brits into giving him some food rations. It's hard going trekking through the remote Patkai's foothills, but the farther away Perry gets from the army, the better. One day, Perry's hiking up a dense mountain slope when he sees something spine-chilling, a basha, or a temporary shelter often made with bamboo. This basha is decorated with human skulls, to which water buffalo horns have been attached. Perry has stumbled into the head-hunting Naga village of Tukumga. Believe it or not, Perry delights the villagers by giving them the remaining canned food rations he got from the British. The Ang, or village chief, invites him to be his honored guest. Perry takes a liking to the chief's 14-year-old daughter. She seems to return his interest. Perry has a new problem. How do you flirt with a girl and impress her warrior father when you don't know the culture or speak the language? The answer is gifts. Perry hikes some 8 miles down the mountain back to the Leyte road. Somehow he manages to get a hold of a load of army goods. Most importantly, he gets an M1 Garand. In Naga culture, tiger pelts and claws are prized. The act of killing a tiger is seen as a virile feat of masculinity. Compared to the clubs and flintlocks the Naga have, with his modern gun, Perry is seen as having the ability to kill many a tiger. The village is impressed. Perry is considered an important man, and the chief allows Perry to marry his daughter. The first few months of Perry's married life are pretty good. He struggles with malaria, but due to his stockpile of army rations, he's rich enough to hire servants to work his fields. Perry spends much of his time hunting monkeys and tigers. He grows fluent in his wife's language. The couple's excited to find out that they're expecting their first child. Many nights, the tribal musicians play flutes and drums while the tribe chants, takes psychoactives, and dances. Meanwhile, the army has offered a 1,000 rupee reward for information leading to Perry's capture. That's upwards of $14,500 in today's money. They assume that he's headed for the city, so they've been searching for him in Calcutta. The legend of Perry is beginning to grow. Warranted or not, he's becoming a folk hero. To the black GIs who stew with the resentment of daily petty racial humiliations, Perry is awesome. Apropos of what actually happened, they see Perry as someone who fought back against the man and won. Eventually, Perry becomes homesick. When he was drafted into the army, he left behind a young daughter and a girlfriend in Washington, D.C. Also, his stockpile of rations is quickly dwindling. He begins to hunger for Western items, especially cigarettes. He hires runners to go down the mountain to trade at the black market in rural towns. Finally, the army finds a clue. In the summer, some 5 months after Perry vanished, a coolie finds the rifle Perry accidentally left behind when he panicked at the bridge. The army realizes they've been searching in the wrong place. They put out feelers in rural towns near where the gun was found. Eventually, a rumor reaches their ears about the chief of Tukumga having a black soldier as a son-in-law. Army brass is incredulous. They never would have expected an unarmed tenderfoot like Perry to survive for so long in the jungle. A runner who had gone to the town of Namyong to get rice quickly comes back to tell Perry that there are men searching for him. Perry leaves his wife in Tukumga and goes to Noksa, or a satellite village. July 20th. Captain Walter McMinn and a small posse of MPs, along with hired Naga guides, go on a 3.5-hour hike up the mountain to Tukumga. None of the Americans speak any Naga. They use a picture of Perry and hand signs to communicate. The posse learns that Perry's gone to the Noksa. By the time that the posse huddles outside of the Noksa making a plan, it's twilight. The MPs get a guide to go ask Perry to borrow his gun for a hunt. The ploy works. It's a common request and Perry agrees, which leaves him unarmed. Army snipers sneak through the brush and position themselves around Perry's basha. They have to be careful. It would be diplomatically unwise to accidentally kill any Naga. While eating dinner, Perry sees flickers of light outside. The Naga don't have flashlights. It can only mean Westerners. Perry thinks about trying to sneak into the pitch-black jungle behind the village, but tigers have recently been a problem. He grabs a dao, or short Chinese sword, and lights a bamboo staff to use as a torch. Getting up his nerve, Perry goes outside. McMinn immediately blinds Perry with his flashlight, ordering him not to move. McMinn fires, but misses. Perry takes off, and the soldiers chase him, shooting as they go. Perry seems to vanish into the jungle, escaping the ambush, but then they find his body at the bottom of a hill. Perry's been shot in the chest. Around 10 p.m., McMinn hikes several hours back to Namyang to get a doctor and more soldiers. Even with the extra manpower, it ends up being a 9-hour ordeal to carry the stretcher bearing the 170-pound, severely injured Perry down the mountain to reach Leyte Road. From there, an ambulance takes Perry to the 73rd Evacuation Hospital at Xingbuyang. Perry spends the next several days recovering. While Perry's hyped up on morphine and other medical drugs, he's frequently interrogated. At first, he denies being Perry, but then finally admits his identity and confesses to shooting Katie. He's coerced into signing a 3-page document that he's told is a statement of what had happened, though Perry thinks some key facts are missing or distorted. Against his better judgment, he notarizes and signs the paperwork. On August 28th, Perry is deemed healthy enough to be transferred to prison. He's sent to the notorious Leyte Stockade, the very prison he was trying to evade when he shot Katie in the first place. This is his second stint in the stockade. Several months before the whole shooting incident, Perry had spent hellish months in Leyte, convicted for disobeying orders when an officer tried to assign him extra work. Though Perry's sentence for disobedience was 90 days, he'd been forced to serve an extra couple of weeks in the stockade without an explanation. The Army assigns Perry a lawyer, Captain Clayton Oberholzer. Unfortunately for Perry, Oberholzer only has experience as a civilian lawyer and has never handled a felony. The fact that Perry killed Katie is indisputable, but Oberholzer hopes to get the charges reduced from premeditated capital murder to manslaughter, the difference being life in prison versus execution if convicted. Perry is also accused of desertion and willful disobedience. September 4th, 1944. Perry's court-martial takes less than 6 hours. Oberholzer fumbles a chance to get the sworn statement Perry made while drugged tossed. He botches explaining that the morning of the murder, a distraught Perry was headed to see Lieutenant Colonel Hyatt, the commander of the camp, who had an open-door policy to chat with the soldiers, white or black. Katie went out of his way to accost Perry with the intent to take him into custody, consciously seeking to prevent him from seeing Hyatt, who might have limited Perry's punishment for going AWOL. When Oberholzer brings up Katie's history of abuse toward black GIs, the tribunal warns him that Katie's character isn't on trial. The vote is unanimous. Perry is dishonorably discharged, must forfeit all pay, and will be hanged by the neck until dead. As part of the Army's due process, the verdict condemning Perry to death must undergo a review by 3 members of the Judge Advocate General's Department in New Delhi. All the way across the world, Perry's mom gets a letter from the Army informing her that her son has been court-martialed, convicted of murder, and is sentenced to hang. Bewildered and frightened, she scraps together some money and hires the best lawyer she can get. Her lawyer submits a brief to the Washington-based office of the Judge Advocate General's Department. The Washington office informs New Delhi that a brief for the Perry case will shortly arrive in the mail. Nearly a month later, on December 15th, the New Delhi office transmits a classified message asking about the brief. It hasn't arrived. It's been lost in the mail. Meanwhile, Perry has been stuck in limbo, imprisoned in Leyte Stockade. He spent his time watching and memorizing guard schedules. Then, on December 15th, Perry makes his move. Late at night, he crawls under the rear of his tent. The sleepy soldier standing guard at the entrance to his tent doesn't notice. Perry only has 11 minutes before the next time the guards make a circuit. Using wire cutters he stole while on work detail, he quickly cuts a hole in the prison fence just big enough to wiggle through. Protected by strips of coarse wool cut from his prison-issue blanket, Perry crawls through the drainage ditches filled with barbed wire. After that, he runs through a field at the stockade's edge and disappears into the jungle. Sweet freedom. Perry stops to catch his breath. He's free, but some 80 miles of mountainous jungle separates him from his wife and unborn child. How's he going to get home? Army brass loses their minds when they realize that Perry has escaped. The Leyte Stockade's warden and 8 guards are formally reprimanded for negligence. The Army again puts a 1,000 rupee bounty on Perry's head. They radio broadcast Perry's description in several languages and print wanted posters. By airplane, they drop some posters on the village of Tkumga. The illiterate Naga villagers collect them, impressed that pictures of the chief's son-in-law are falling from the heavens. MPs begin stopping black soldiers at random based on the chances that they might be helping Perry. Whenever they can, many black soldiers tear up the wanted posters. They enjoy swapping tales and rumors of the Jungle King. The law brief in defense of Perry finally reaches New Delhi on December 27th. The advocate judge's review finds some of the army's actions questionable, but reconfirms the verdict of execution. In the wee hours of January 1st, 1945, Perry is almost caught at an abandoned timber camp by a posse of MPs who had heard rumors of a black soldier hiding there. Luckily for Perry, he's a light sleeper and escapes into the jungle just in time. A bullet barely grazes him. The MPs recover a .45 pistol Perry accidentally left behind. February 19th. Two black soldiers, Staff Sergeant Toomer and T4 Troxler, are buying liquor in the town of Makum when Perry suddenly storms the bootlegger's shack. Somehow he's gotten a replacement .45 pistol. He mugs the two soldiers of 95 rupees and forces the bootlegger to cook him dinner. Perry asks Toomer and Troxler to do him a favor. He wants them to bring a truck stocked with rations, clothes, a tent, a knife, and ammunition in the next 24 hours. They agree to meet Perry in Makum the following night. Even though he stole money from them, Toomer and Troxler debate what to do. Ultimately, they decide to tell the army, mainly out of fear of what could happen to them if the army found out that they had suppressed information about Perry. They inform Major Earl Owen Cullum, commanding officer of the 159th Military Police Battalion at nearby Chapo camp. Cullum decides to set up a trap. The soldiers will arrive with the truck and the army will ambush Perry. Toomer and Troxler agree to help as long as the army keeps it a secret that they betrayed the Jungle King. However, Perry has anticipated a trap. A crowd of coolies shows up to meet Toomer and Troxler. The army doesn't see Perry, but even if he's there, they can't shoot without risking a diplomatic incident. Suddenly, from among the crowd, Perry sprints for the truck and hops aboard. He forces Toomer and Troxler to drive away down the road, but there's a snag. A checkpoint's coming up. Perry gets out of the truck to trek through the jungle around the checkpoint. Toomer directs Perry to meet them at a grassy field on the far side. Perry doesn't know that this is the army's plan B. As he reaches the field, MPs fire at Perry, but again he escapes into the jungle. This time he's wounded. A bullet nicked his right foot. He packs it full of moss so it won't get infected, a trick he learned from the Naga. Perry limps through the jungle and hides in a rice paddy. Hours later, he awakes to the barking of German shepherds. The army's caught up to him. Perry escapes yet again. This time, the tip of his nose gets grazed by a bullet. He puts moss on this wound, too. Cullum receives a scolding note from his commanding officer for letting Perry get away. Cullum vows to capture Perry. February 22nd. A desperate Perry hides by the side of the Leyte road. His new plan is to board a truck, hide among the supplies, and hitch a ride over the mountains. When the truck reaches Burma, he'll ditch it and disappear into the jungle. But Perry is unwell. The gunshot on his foot is very painful. Also, he's had to drink river water and has caught dysentery. When Perry tries to hop on the back of a slow-moving truck, he's too weak and falls in the road, dropping yet another .45. The gun skids further away as it hits the ground. Perry realizes that a coolie has witnessed his failed hijack attempt. Spooked, he quickly melts back into the jungle. For the third time, he leaves a gun behind. Cullum starts a mobile posse to hunt Perry. He begins visiting town after town to question locals. He also coordinates with the British and native police forces. He and his fellow posse follow Perry's trail for over 2 weeks. Cullum eventually figures out that Perry's headed in the direction of the town of Namrup. Perry's following the southeastern branch of the Desang River. It's a long, indirect route to Tunga. However, Perry's probably taking this way because just south of Namrup is considered the gateway to the Naga heartland. Here, Perry would be able to make friends. Chances are some of the Naga tribes speak the same language as Perry's wife. Cullum realizes he has only a few days to catch up with Perry before he vanishes into a remote area again, maybe this time forever. Meanwhile, Perry's been growing weaker by the day from dysentery and malnutrition. He's surviving on stolen sugarcane and begging farmers for rice. Stupidly, Toomer and Troxler mention they're snitching on Perry to a colleague. The army has to evacuate them from Asia over threats of murder from Perry's fans. After a long, rough journey, the posse arrives in Namrup. Cullum receives a tip as to where Perry is. He's staying at a rural farm a few miles away. The posse waits until nightfall before hiking to the farm. Cautiously, the posse fans out and surrounds the farmer's basha. They find 3 Naga tribesmen wearing traditional dhotis sitting by a fire outside of the home. Cullum senses that there's something not quite right. He takes a closer look at the men. He then grabs one of them. It's Perry. He cut his afro and borrowed native clothing, hoping that he can pass for Naga by firelight. For the last time, Perry is taken into custody. Under tight security, a sickly Perry is transported to the Chapo stockade and kept in an isolation cell. The army decides not to return him to Leyte stockade. They fear a potential racial uprising. Perry's interrogated by MPs who want to know where he got his guns. Perry refuses to snitch. He's sorry over Katie's death, but also says that he would have killed his pursuers if he had a chance. March 15, 1945. A few days after his capture, Perry is woken before dawn and under extremely tight security transported to Leyte stockade. Per his last request, Perry is allowed to write a farewell letter to his brother Aaron and given a final cigarette before he's quietly hanged just after 7 a.m. March 17th. Perry's mother receives a notice from the army informing her of her son's death by judicial asphyxiation due to his own misconduct. Despite repeated requests for information, she hasn't heard anything since her lawyer submitted the brief in December. She knows nothing of her son's escapades or anti-hero status. Some months later, a small group of black GIs are on an expedition through the Patkai Mountains to check for survivors of a crashed cargo plane. They hire some Naga guides and end up spending the night at a remote village where one of the guides' relatives lives. As guests, the GI are served a special treat for dessert, canned fruit cocktail. One of the soldiers curiously inquires as to where the cocktail has come from. The next morning, before they leave, the soldiers are taken to the only basha in the village, painted a bright yellow-orange. It turns out to be owned by the chief's teenage daughter. Inside, the walls are decorated with wanted posters of Perry. It's January 13, 2006, a beautiful summer day in Buenos Aires, Argentina, when a call went out to local police at 12:38 p.m. that Banco Rio was being robbed. Located in a serene, rich neighborhood in Argentina's capital, the prestigious bank contained a fortune in its vaults. Police officers arrived at the scene to discover that 4 thieves and 23 hostages were inside. They secured the perimeter, guarding the only 2 possible exits from the bank. After communicating and negotiating with the robbers throughout most of the afternoon, the thieves suddenly went silent. At 7 p.m., police officers broke into Banco Rio and found a confounding scene. The hostages were alive and well. Almost 150 safety deposit boxes were forced open and emptied of their contents, and the robbers were gone. No sign of the thieves could be found. No windows were broken, and the exits had been watched by police the whole time. How did these thieves get away with what's become known as the robbery of the century? How did they disappear under the careful watch of more than 100 police officers? We dug deep into this infamous Argentinian bank heist to find out. Banco Rio, now known as Banco Santander Rio, was one of Argentina's leading financial institutions, with branches throughout the country. One of its branches was nestled in the calm, wealthy neighborhood of San Isidro in Buenos Aires' northern suburbs. How well off was San Isidro? Well, the neighborhood now has 2 golf courses, a sailing club, and a jockey club. You can almost see the residents clutching their pearls. In 2016, Argentina was already no stranger to infamous bank robberies. In fact, a heist had happened a few years earlier and had left the nation reeling, and as it turns out, inspired the heist of Banco Rio. In 1999, thieves had broken into a bank in Ramajo, Argentina, and taken hostages in order to negotiate their freedom from police. The robbers tried to leave the bank using the hostages as shields, and police opened fire, killing one of the robbers, but also 2 innocent hostages. As though the tragic event wasn't enough of a PR nightmare for the police, the whole bank heist had been shown on live TV via the many news cameras at the scene. Most Argentinians had seen both the robbery and the killings go down in real time. The nation was in shock. As a result of the Ramajo case, police in the 2006 Banco Rio heist were more reluctant to take drastic actions when they arrived at the scene of a bank robbery in progress. That warm January day, with even more news cameras trained on the hostage situation at Banco Rio, police were going to move as carefully as possible. Then again, they weren't in a rush because they thought they had the thieves trapped and surrounded. Over 100 officers had shown up at the scene, and every vantage point to the bank that wasn't occupied by a news photographer was occupied by a sniper. The 2 bank exits were covered. Where could the thieves go? One of the robbers inside, who bypassed several cool Argentinian names to codename himself Walter instead, was negotiating the release of hostages with the police. The thieves let the bank's security guard walk out the door unharmed, then a young man and then a young woman as well. It seemed like things were going well and the robbers were playing along with the cops. Walter, who had been given the nickname of the man in the gray suit, seemed to be in a strangely happy mood given the gravity of the situation. He and the other thieves were treating the hostages well. At one point, they sang happy birthday to one of the bank employees after discovering it was the man's birthday, which is more than you remembered to do for most of your friends last year without Facebook reminding you. Later on, around 3:30 p.m., Walter called police to complain that the 23 remaining hostages were hungry and they'd like some pizza. After this call, the line went silent. What was happening inside Banco Rio? For 3 hours, with Walter having ghosted them, the police had no idea what to do. Did they barge in, putting the hostages in danger and risking another Ramayo-like situation? Like a needy ex, they kept trying to contact Walter even after several missed calls. Finally, special forces lined up and forced their way in to discover a truly unbelievable situation. 23 hostages were being held or had been locked into 3 separate floors: the lobby, the mezzanine, and the basement of the conference room. The thieves were nowhere to be found. Police even double-checked to see if they were hiding among the hostages, but could not find them. When they entered the basement, they realized what the thieves had really been after. Out of the 400 reinforced steel safe deposit boxes in the basement, 143 had been cracked open. Why didn't the thieves steal cash from the bank instead? Well, most Argentinians at the time were pretty distrustful of the country's banking system. During the 2001 economic crisis in Argentina, the banking system had collapsed, wiping out the fortunes of those who had most of their money in bank accounts. Viewing money held in bank accounts as suspiciously as most people view Bitcoin today, Argentinians instead decided they'd only use the banks for their safe deposit boxes, which couldn't be wiped out in the event of a crisis. In these safeguarded boxes, Argentinians piled in their cash, jewelry, and other valuable items that they could always reclaim in the event of an emergency. Given that San Isidro was an exceptionally rich neighborhood, the safe deposit boxes of this particular branch of Banco Rio contained an immense amount of wealth. After the officers found so many of the boxes forced open, they also found the only few pieces of evidence the thieves had left behind: a battery pack, a tool that the police assumed had been used to crack open the boxes, and a row of toy guns. That's right, the robbers had conducted this epic bank heist without even using real weapons. The last item police found was perhaps the most perplexing and obnoxious piece of evidence. The robbers, trying to make some sort of poetic statement, left behind a note that read, "In a neighborhood of rich people without weapons or grudges, it's just money, not love." Argentinians throughout the country lacking Netflix at the time had been watching the whole robbery unfold for hours from their televisions, and now saw that the thieves had pulled off an impossible escape as well. Public opinions and rumors in Argentina almost immediately depicted the robbers as Robin Hood-like folk heroes. After all, they had stolen from the rich, hadn't harmed anyone, and given the money to, well, it seemed like they'd given it to themselves. But still, their heist was somewhat ingenious. So who was at the center of it all? And how had they executed and gotten away with such a perfect heist? Well, the mastermind behind the robbery of the century turned out to be a man named Fernando Araujo. You see, the Ramayo bank heist had made an impression on Araujo, who thought that the robbers had almost pulled off the perfect heist, but botched it all up when they tried to leave. One day, when Araujo was a few bong hits deep and talking to a dear friend, he thought of the obvious. What if the robbers never had to leave? What if instead they disappeared through a hole? Araujo's friend, Sebastian Garcia Bolster, agreed that this sounded like a crazy yet perfect plan. However, he didn't pay his friend's theory much attention, as Bolster was neither a criminal or in any dire financial straits. Also, most people don't take grand stoned plans seriously. Araujo and Bolster had grown up together in an upper middle-class neighborhood also located in the northern suburbs of Buenos Aires. And while Araujo sometimes dabbled in hobbies on the wrong side of the law, Bolster enjoyed a completely legal lifestyle. Bolster had a wife and a child and was mechanically inclined, repairing mostly small engines for money and tinkering around with inventions. Araujo, on the other hand, had a very impulsive and somewhat eccentric lifestyle, teaching martial arts occasionally to pay the bills while also cultivating marijuana for money. He was a free-spirited artist who was dealing with a recent breakup, as many free-spirited artists do, melodramatically. He decided he needed to remove the world from his personal space, so he blacked out the windows of his loft. According to others, Araujo ate relatively little and slept whenever the mood hit him. Frequently high on weed, permanently underfed, and presumably lacking a whole lot of vitamin D, Araujo was drawn towards stranger and stranger ideas. His biggest obsession? Bank robberies. Apparently, Araujo voraciously consumed any and all media involving bank robbers, from movies and shows to documentaries of real-life heists. His goal was to observe the mistakes other fictional and real robbers made, and use these observations to plan out the perfect heist. In 2004, Araujo finally realized that he had not only figured out a plan, but also needed his friend Bolster's mechanical and technical knowledge to help him. Bolster wasn't too happy about the idea, and he knew banks were harder to break into than most people thought, as he had worked part-time in a bank for a while. However, he was also furious that his father and grandfather had entrusted money to banks and then lost it all during economic downturns. So, like many people, he ended up hating bankers. When Araujo guaranteed Bolster that no one would get hurt, in fact they wouldn't even have real weapons, Bolster agreed to the plan and got to work. So what exactly is the prep work for a robbery of the century? Thanks partly to its temperamental weather, Buenos Aires has plenty of storm drains underneath the streets that lead directly out to the river. The robbers would enter one that ran close to the bank and then dig up a tunnel to connect it to the bank itself. However, bypassing the bank's nighttime alarm system would be a huge challenge, much more difficult than digging a hole. So how would the thieves turn off the bank's alarm system? Simple, by not tripping it at all. The thieves would rob the safe deposit boxes in the bank's basement in the daytime when the alarm wasn't set. But the bank was swarmed with people. How would they enter a bank during the workday and not draw attention to themselves, emptying the safe deposit boxes? In Araujo's mind, the answer was even simpler. Stage a fake bank robbery upstairs to cover the real bank robbery going on in the basement. Some say the phrase, "it's so crazy it just might work," was born that day. The duo then proceeded to assemble a crew of experienced thieves, financiers, and misfits they'd need to pull off the job, presumably in an Ocean's 11-style montage. Enter an experienced bank robber named Doc and his associate Ruben Alberto de la Torre, nicknamed Beto. They were former members of an Argentinian group of armed bank robbers known unimaginatively as Super Banda. Another fixer and getaway driver were added to the crew. Araujo also found a financer and problem solver in retired rich Uruguayan thief Luis Mario Vitet Searas, who invested $100,000 into the operation. What did they need the money for? Well, Bolster had come up with a way to get into the bank, spend a lot of time and energy tunneling through, and find a relatively unobtrusive way to get the safe deposit boxes open so they wouldn't be heard from upstairs. Bolster decided to rent a safe deposit box at another Banco Rio branch, noted down the brand name, and ordered a few boxes himself to find the best way to open them. He concluded that a jackhammer punching through the locks would do the job, and could be kept to a reasonable noise level. He built a jackhammer that could be transported in pieces to the bank, assembled there, and then taken apart. However, as anyone who's seen The Italian Job or almost any heist movie knows, getting a lot of valuable heavy goods out of the location you're robbing presents its own challenge. Since the thieves were going to drop back down into water-filled drains, getting the goods into Zodiac boats seemed like a good idea, but the water level was usually too low to hold up the loaded-down boats. However, since Bolster couldn't make it rain, no more puns we swear, he naturally decided he'd build a wooden dam in his shop, disassemble it, and reassemble it in the storm drain over several days. The morning of the heist, the 7 men met for coffee, because apparently even bank robbers need caffeine to start their day, and then dispersed to start the heist of the century. Bolster headed to the storm drains to make his way toward the bank underground. Julian Zayo Echevarria drove the getaway car to a pre-arranged meeting spot. Vitet and a mystery man named Luis the Uruguayan drove a stolen car to the garage under the bank, while the rest of the men drove another stolen car to the bank itself. Beto and Doc headed in first, with Beto waving around a toy gun he had stolen from his 9-year-old son that morning. Shockingly, this worked, and everyone in the bank immediately dropped to the floor. Araujo left another stolen car outside the bank purposely to make it look like a getaway vehicle, so police would think they had found the robbers' escape plan. Araujo walked into the bank in a baseball cap, ski mask, long blonde wig, sunglasses, and how he managed to avoid weird looks on the sidewalk before entering is anyone's guess. Meanwhile, Bolster had reached the end of the tunnel he had dug and was just chilling in the dark underneath the bank. Doc went down, broke the basement wall separating the bank from Bolster's tunnel, and let Bolster in to help with the robbery, unbeknownst to anyone inside the bank. This was because Luis and Beto had already subdued and isolated the hostages. Vitet then took on the persona of Walter to deal with the cops that had just arrived, in order to make the police believe that the robbers had been caught in a heist gone wrong. Araujo's plan was somewhat brilliant. The thieves were basically staging a visible botched bank robbery upstairs to cover the invisible robbery happening in the basement. Vitet even released a few hostages, one after the other, to make the police think they'd had the upper hand and could get the rest of the hostages through negotiation alone. The whole crew had been told they had 2 hours to get in and out. Bolster assembled his jackhammer-like contraption in 20 minutes and spent another hour and a half opening safe deposit boxes. After Vitet got the signal from Araujo to come downstairs, he told the cops to order pizza and then went down in the basement, telling the hostages if they moved, they'd be killed. Beto and Vitet helped Bolster stuff the valuables into bags, while Araujo and Doc sprayed bleach to destroy any DNA and threw around fistfuls of hair from a barbershop floor to confuse the police even further, as you do in a bank heist. As the men exited through Bolster's tunnel, they cleaned up all the evidence of the broken wall, wall and hid the hole behind a large heavy cabinet. The men piled into the Zodiacs, and even though the motor malfunctioned, Araujo had brought paddles. The men paddled to the getaway van 10 blocks away, used a previously tested pulley system to haul the bags up from the storm drain, and drove off, all while police still thought they had bank robbers surrounded in Banco Rio. When the police officers eventually stormed the bank, the robbers were already home watching the report on live TV, finally eating their long-awaited pizza. Bolster, being one of the smartest of the group and figuring credit cards would be the most useless of the valuables as they could be canceled, scattered all the cards all over various streets far away from the gang's actual route out of the bank. This not only left no clear trail toward the robbers, it also created a lot of false leads for police, as every time a passerby would pick up a credit card and try to use it, the police would have to hunt them down and see if they were involved. Frustrated, tired, and with no viable leads, the police, like any Love is Blind contestant, realized they'd been publicly humiliated on TV. So, wait, if the robbers got away with it, how do we know the names and stories of everyone involved in the crime? Well, as it usually happens in life, even the most carefully thought-out plan can be undone with one dumb, egocentric mistake. When Beto brought home the money, he bragged to his wife, Alicia, that he and his friends had robbed Banco Rio. Considering Beto had a habit of frequently cheating on Alicia, disclosing this information so readily probably wasn't the best idea. When some of the valuables went missing from the house, Beto and Alicia had a huge fight that led to the unraveling of the whole heist. Sure enough, 5 weeks later, Beto got pulled over by police while out driving with his mistress. Apparently, Alicia told him the whole story of the heist and identified Beto, Araujo, Bolster, Vicet, and Zayo Echevarria as robbers as well, as she had seen them work on the getaway van in her garage. Alicia didn't point fingers toward Doc and the mysterious Uruguayan Luis, as she had never seen them in her house, and they presumably hadn't cheated on her. The men were all tried and sent to jail, though most have been released by now and are presumably still pissed at Beto for being unable to keep it in his pants. However, their daring heist lives on in infamy in Argentina. Guns, tanks, stealth jets, and lasers? The US military has a pretty advanced army, and buried in those vaults are some of the strangest weapons ever invented. Here are the craziest military weapons the army still uses today. Number 20. Atchison Assault Shotgun. Everyone knows the positives of a shotgun. They hit like a tank, complete with an earth-shattering sound. The cons? Very limited capacity. That makes it useful for scaring off a daughter's boyfriend or blowing the head off a zombie, but maybe not so much in combat. Military weapons require both accuracy, ease of use, and high capacity, not something shotguns are typically known for. Enter the Atchison. Also known as the Auto Assault 12, this gun is one of the only automatic combat shotguns ever created. It only needs the user to make a quick trigger pull to fire and can fire up to a whopping 300 shots a minute. While this model was designed in the 1980s and has largely fallen out of favor, future designs built on it and combat shotguns are still used today. Making them even more useful, the powerful recoil that comes with a shotgun, knocking many an unexpected user off their feet, is barely present here. It takes the power of a shotgun and combines it with the accuracy and use of a rifle. But sometimes the best way to survive combat is not to be seen. Number 19. Adaptive Camouflage. It's hard to get a convoy through enemy territory. One wrong move and you could come under attack from dozens of snipers, and staying under the radar is easier when you're not taking massive military vehicles with you. Camouflage has been used by militaries for thousands of years, often as simple as the color of clothing soldiers wear. But disguising something large like a tank is a different story. In 2011, that all changed as BAE Systems announced an incredible new program that could protect convoys from enemy eyes. But could someone really make a tank invisible? Surprisingly, yes. The adaptive camouflage system was simply surprisingly effective. The sides of the armored vehicle would be covered with around 1,000 hexagonal panels that would take thermal images of everything around the vehicle. They would then reflect what was on the other side, creating an image of an area without the vehicle in it. Alternatively, the camouflage could reflect the chosen image, like a harmless car driving through, to eliminate suspicion. The infrared stealth system remains one of the top choices for high-tech camouflage available today. Sometimes what an army needs is strength. Number 18. Hulk. No, they're not dropping a green giant guy on the enemy, although that would be pretty effective. The Human Universal Load Carrier was an attempt by Berkeley Robotics starting in the year 2000 to see what a human can do when given a little assistance. Carrying equipment is one of the biggest challenges of the Army, and it often makes it hard to travel from one location to another. So, the scientists asked, what if we could increase a soldier's carrying capacity? By how much? How about an inhuman 200 pounds while traveling 10 miles an hour? and all it would take was a simple exoskeleton. The Hulk was designed to fit around the legs and back, providing support and a powered assist while carrying a massively heavy backpack. Powered by batteries, it would run for up to 8 hours while marching and could operate for days with lighter use. While it did perform up to par for weight and none of the troops using it were injured by the weights, the Army wasn't quite satisfied with the freedom of movement it offered, and it could cause strain on muscles. While it's not currently used in combat, interest in the project remains, bringing us all a little bit closer to being Iron Man. In combat, the most important factor is none other than accuracy. Number 17. Precision-guided firearm. In today's Army, many of the soldiers are trained marksmen, but many only get basic training. And in the event of a draft, it's likely some would be thrown into combat with only a few weeks of training. That's why today's military is focused on how to take a little of the work off the soldier and onto the gun itself. The precision-guided firearm is an upgraded sniper rifle that not only has the traditional tracking scope, but comes with wireless smart technology to pick up data to make it easier to hit your target. And when we say pick up data, we mean all of the data. The most advanced of all these weapons can hack into a local and larger network to pick up data from voice and video all around. The digital scope can also provide visual assistance for locking onto the target, similar to how fighter jets often have precise targeting mechanisms. If this sounds like super spy territory, that's because it is, and many of these weapons can track targets and figure out the best possible vantage point to hit them from, without much input from the man behind the scope. But what if it wasn't just the gun that was smart? Number 16. Smart bullets. Precision-guided munitions are not new. Missiles and torpedoes are often equipped with guiding mechanisms that can not only just lock onto targets, but change their trajectory if the target moves. In 2008, the Exacto program at DARPA switched their strategy from focusing solely on smart guns, developing bullets that can have the same abilities. The earliest model would illuminate the target with a laser designator, and the bullet would be keyed to follow that. It would be able to track targets up to a mile away and change position 30 times a second. But modern designs might be even more advanced. The research into smart bullets is ongoing, and Dr. Roland Barrett developed a model that would have 3 fiber optic eyes around it for tracking. Other designed bullets would be able to be controlled by radio waves or travel around corners automatically without needing to be fired from a curved barrel. These weapons are still in development, and the biggest roadblock in their way? Money. After all, most soldiers will only use one gun, but a lot of bullets, and making every one of them a smart bullet would involve a lot of technology. Maybe time to send those bullets through community college instead. Sometimes, though, you need non-lethal weapons. Number 15. Taser Shockwave. A stun gun can be a useful way to neutralize an enemy without killing or seriously hurting them, like when you need them coherent for interrogation. But that becomes a lot harder when the person is part of a large group of enemies, and they're all coming right at you. They're probably going to overwhelm you before you get the chance to fire the taser more than once, and that's if you don't run out of charge. But what if you could fire 10 tasers at one time? That's the question the mad scientists at the Taser Corporation decided to answer, and the resulting weapon was amazing, if not exactly practical. Meet the Taser Shockwave, a battery of stun guns attached to cables and loaded into a launcher. When triggered, the tasers shoot out and deliver powerful shocks to just about anyone they hit. It might look like a many-headed dragon, but it's effective at incapacitating attackers quickly and in large numbers, if it hits the target. Accuracy isn't really its strong suit, and in a combat situation, there's no guarantee it would hit its target. Taser continues to refine the weapon, and some think it might be more suited to crowd control than combat. And sometimes, you need weapons in the most unusual circumstances. Number 14. Heckler & Koch P11. You're on a submarine, and you get an alert. A saboteur is trying to sink you. You get into the water to engage, but there is just one problem. Your gun isn't equipped for firing underwater. Ordinary rounds lose range and accuracy when fired underwater. Fortunately, you're armed with the Heckler & Koch P11, one of the best underwater pistols ever developed. It's short and stubby, looking more like a checkout scanner than a gun, but it packs a punch. But the surface isn't the only thing that makes it different. The P11 only has 5 barrels as opposed to the usual 6. It fires steel darts rather than traditional bullets, but they can still tear through the enemy. And rather than being traditionally fired, it uses a battery pack in the grip. Also, don't use it recklessly. It can't be reloaded by users and has to be returned to the factory for more ammo. This isn't a weapon that's used too often unless we wind up fighting an army from the lost city of Atlantis, but its secrets are well kept. So well, in fact, its manufacturer won't comment on it. Sometimes the military goes small, and sometimes they go big. Number 13. Electromagnetic Laboratory Railgun. The U.S. Office of Naval Research is not a place you get into easily. This is where all the prototypes of the most advanced weapons in the military's stable can be found. But one of them has the potential to be one of the deadliest weapons ever created, taking an already powerful tool and supercharging it with modern technology. A railgun is a massive weapon that fires projectiles at rapid speed and would be one of the most powerful weapons in the U.S. arsenal without needing the equipment for traditional firing. So what is the secret of this massive prototype? Instead of chemicals designed to ignite explosions, this railgun would fire projectiles entirely using magnetic fields and electricity, and they would travel faster and hit harder than any bullet currently available, up to a whopping 5,600 miles per hour. This gives the railgun power associated with cruise missiles. It's currently in testing, and the military is optimistic about mounting it on ships soon enough. But to get there, they'll have to perfect the repeated fire capability, because for this gun, it's both quantity and quality, and that means a lot more tests. But what if the military didn't need to use humans at all? Number 12. The Fire Scout. When troops are in a pitched firefight and they see a helicopter from up above, it usually means one thing: backup is here. But the powerful defense contractor Northrop Grumman has given a new twist. The helicopter is here to provide support, but that doesn't mean there's anyone on board. The Fire Scout looks almost exactly like a standard military chopper, but you'll see a few differences. For one thing, it doesn't have windows, because there's no one inside to look out of them. The Fire Scout might be the most advanced drone ever created. It can take off and land independently, provide aerial fire support for ground troops, and has a top-of-the-line targeting system. While it's designed to be used in combat, it's also an effective surveillance tool. It was declared mission-capable in 2019 and took to the skies, although the Navy continues to develop and enhance it. This raises the question: if the smart machines are the wave of the future, which other heavy artillery could soon be roaming the battlefield without any soldiers on board? Naturally, we're about to find out. Number 11. The Black Knight. Tanks are the workhorse of the military. These treaded vehicles provide valuable shelter for soldiers, run over enemy lines, and are equipped with powerful guns. There's just one downside. If they take a hard hit, they can be hard to escape from in a hurry, which is why the mad geniuses of BAE Systems asked, what if we had a tank without the vulnerable people inside? Enter the Black Knight, a 12-ton tank designed as an unmanned ground combat vehicle. It looks like an ordinary tank on the surface, but much like the Fire Scout, looks can be deceiving. Let's just say you don't want to be in the way of this drone. It's armed with both a turret-mounted large gun and a coaxial machine gun, runs on traditional Caterpillar diesel engines, and its tractor treads make it ideal for off-road operations. It's operated by remote control, but also can use its computer system to make in-combat decisions, independently of operator input. While it's ideal for missions that are too dangerous to send soldiers into the field, its technology is still a work in progress as the military tries to perfect the wireless communication system. But many people in power think this is the remote tank that might be the wave of the future. The military has developed many non-lethal weapons, some with a devastating impact. Number 10. Phaser. It looks like a sci-fi laser gun, and it kinda acts like it too. The Phaser, officially titled the Personnel Halting and Stimulation Response Rifle, is a massive laser dazzler gun designed by the Air Force's Research Division. It doesn't fire a projectile, but can neutralize an entire field of enemies in seconds by unleashing a massive burst of light that can temporarily blind them. This is a low-intensity laser, which means that the victim should recover quickly, but it can leave an entire field of soldiers stumbling among each other and firing nowhere in particular. So why is this weapon not everywhere yet? It's not that the gun didn't work, it's that the military had to make sure it didn't work too well. Blinding weapons that can cause permanent damage are banned under a 1995 UN protocol, and using them is seen as a crime against humanity. So the military needed to make sure there were no lasting side effects. They also had to give it a really cool name, and someone in the design process was definitely a Star Trek fan. But unlike its namesake weapon, this one only has a stun setting. This next weapon might be the way out of some close quarters. Number 9. The Corner Shot. In the 1940s, the Nazi army debuted a new weapon, the Krumlauf, a rifle with a curved barrel that could shoot around corners. It was an innovative solution to a major combat problem, and it was a complete failure, with the bullets getting jammed and damaging the barrel after only a few shots. But over 50 years later, the design might have been perfected, ironically by an Israel weapons designer named Amos Golan. Designed in cooperation with American investors, the Corner Shot has become a key tool for modern militaries. But technology has marched on since the 1940s, and it shows. Unlike the failed version, this weapon doesn't try to shoot a bullet through through a curved barrel. Instead, it mounts to a small pistol on the end of a larger weapon, allowing it to be aimed at the target that can be seen through a periscope lens. And it's not a high-powered weapon, but it's one that makes shooting targets from the safety of cover much easier. And in case you're looking for a little more firepower, it can be equipped with a 40mm grenade launcher that can send rounds flying in any direction you choose, without the risk of blowing up your own barrel. Sometimes it's not about the firepower you pack, but it's about what you see. Number 8. IVAS. Soldiers can be armed with the best weapons in the world, but in the fog of war, they're dependent on their own eyesight. If they're caught in smoke or in a snowstorm, their aim might be off, leading to missed targets or worse, friendly fire casualties. This gets even more dangerous when the enemy releases vision-clouding weapons, letting them get the drop on the soldiers, which is why teams in the United States Army are working on a unique new headset, one that will not just clear their vision, but plunge the soldiers into a new world. Are our soldiers ready for virtual reality? The Integrated Visual Augmentation System, or IVAS, is an augmented reality headset that eliminates visual fog and provides soldiers with a unique array of image options. This includes a thermal setting, so soldiers will be able to see hidden enemies. It also can filter out interference and let soldiers focus on what's important. The headset is in final testing, and the Army plans to use it both as a field tool and a training tool, with soldiers able to engage against virtual enemies in the headset. Maybe exclusive headset video games will soon make some pro gamers sign up for the service too. It's not the only field where the military is working on what sounds like science fiction. Number 7. Quantum Stealth. Guy Kramer comes from Canadian innovation royalty, being the grandson of the man who invented the first walkie-talkie. But he might be looking to outdo his granddad by cracking a concept H.G. Wells invented in fiction over a century ago. How do you turn someone invisible? The military has been working on a vehicle camouflage for a while, but options for mobile soldiers are much limited. That's where Quantum Stealth comes into play, a long-term project between Kramer's company Hyperstealth and military officials in both Canada and the USA. So what's the secret to his innovation? The keys to Quantum Stealth are being kept close to the military's chest, but what we know is that Quantum Stealth uses lenticular lenses, the same technology seen in 3D movie posters. The lenses refract light according to the angle they're viewed at, and the way that they're arranged creates dead spots where the object isn't visible, but the background is. While it doesn't render the subject completely invisible and can create a blurry spot, it's more than effective enough to confuse a soldier observing from a distance. So it's no surprise the government is investing heavily in the technology. But sometimes you need an earth-shattering kaboom. Number 6. XN1 Laws. Unleash the Death Ray. Laser weapons are part of science fiction lore, but the US government doesn't want to destroy any planets with them, we hope. The advantage of lasers is that they use a simple powered device and don't rely on ammunition, so they can deliver more than one hit in quick succession. The XN1 Laws was developed by the US Navy and first deployed for field testing in 2014, and the USS Ponce was the lucky ship to get to fire it first. It uses an infrared beam launched from a laser array to hit flying and sea-based targets. So, how does it work? For one thing, it's highly energy efficient, needing only an energy pulse to fire and none of the equipment. It can also be adjusted for power, being useful for temporarily blinding enemies at the lowest level. But when it's dialed up to the maximum level of 30,000 watts, it can deliver a massive punch. Not only can it target motors and fry sensors, but it can detonate explosive material on an enemy boat before it reaches its target. It might not be able to blow up enemy battleships from afar, but it's the most effective laser weapon yet. And when it comes to non-lethal tech, sometimes things get weird. Number 5. LED Incapacitator. The enemy is advancing, and the only thing that will defeat them is a flashlight? Well, not just any flashlight. The LED Incapacitator is one of the oddest weapons designed by the Department of Homeland Security's Innovation Research Office, and it's largely designed for use at border crossings and other locations where confrontations with suspicious individuals who might be carrying contraband are likely. Rather than using a traditional weapon, this weapon unleashes a series of random pulses of multicolored light, which switch frequencies often and cause pressure on the brain, and the effects can be messy. The first symptom is a severe headache, and subjects can experience temporary blindness because their eyes can't adjust to the flashing lights. But they also can't focus, become disoriented, and are hit with a wave of nausea, which is why this weapon has earned the nickname the Puke Ray. It's largely an effective weapon against individual targets, but some subjects have been proven largely immune. While it hasn't been deployed everywhere due to concerns over its effectiveness, the odds are it would at least be a useful distractor. But that's nothing compared to what this next non-lethal weapon does. Number 4. Active Denial System. The U.S. military and defense contractor Raytheon wanted a way to maintain perimeter security and crowd control without having to rely on live fire, and they developed an option that comes out of science fiction. Known as the ADS, it works by firing an energy beam of similar wavelength to the way a microwave oven works. But instead of heating up your frozen burrito, the ADS is going to heat up you. It activates the water and fat molecules in the skin, suddenly heating them and creating a painful effect that sends anyone hit with it running. But surely, microwaving people can't be ethical, right? While the technology is scary, the effects have been minimal. A microscopic percentage of those affected develop minor burns and blistering, while most retreat from the painful sensation without suffering any obvious injuries. While the device could seriously hurt someone if focused on them, the device is intended to protect perimeters and deter people from entering, meaning they'll have the option to run away as soon as they feel the heat. Authorities are now exploring deploying it in both theaters of war and as a way to keep prisoners from escaping over the fence. This next weapon raises the question, is James Bond becoming real? Number 3. The Armatix IP-1. This weapon doesn't look like much, it's just a standard handgun. But if the agent carrying it gets attacked and disarmed, the enemy grabs their gun, they'll be in for an unpleasant surprise. Because it doesn't matter how many bullets are in the chamber, that gun is not firing. The Armatix IP-1, developed by a famous German firearms manufacturer, is notable for being one of the most advanced smart guns in the world. Not only is it optimized to be safe and easy to fire and equipped with a camera, but it can only be fired by its authorized user, and it pulls that off with an unassuming accessory. The Armatix IP-1 comes in 2 parts, the gun and the wristwatch it's linked to. It might look like a standard accessory, but it's actually an RFID system that communicates with a handgun and can wirelessly affect it when within 10 inches. If the gun is separated from the watch wearer, it becomes a paperweight. This is one watch battery you don't want to run out, so it indicates the charge on both parts, and it comes with a targeting system that can identify and only fire toward the assigned target. It's not a surprise that this gun is not only being considered for classified missions, but many people want some of its features added to standard guns. But what's the ultimate frontier in combat? It just might be droids. Number 2. Modular Advanced Armed Robotics System. What's better than armed combat vehicle drones? How about an armed robotic soldier that can head into battle instead of humans? We might be a long way from the cyborg wars, but that hasn't stopped the Defense Department from dreaming big. They've been experimenting with combat robots for a while, and the current models are more advanced than ever. Coming soon to a battlefield near you, the Mars, a nearly 400-pound robot armed with sensors, weapons, and cameras, and it's packing more firepower than any human could carry. How much? How about a machine gun? 4 grenade launchers, the capability to fire non-lethal gear like tear gas, as well as laser dazzler and a loudspeaker for communicating safely with the enemy. For non-combat missions, the Mars can be equipped with the ability to carry up to 120 pounds. While some combat robots are designed for artificial intelligence, the Mars is more analog, controlled by an operator at base like a drone. But it doesn't need to be a smart robot, it's got enough brawn to make up for the brains. But there's one more robot in the field that might take you by surprise and make you say, "What a good boy." Number 1. Robot dogs. A battlefield is stressful enough, but imagine seeing a large 4-legged animal approaching you. It looks kind of like a dog, but the proportions are off and it's moving fast. This isn't some weird desert beast, it's one of the military's most popular innovations, the Big Dog. This 4-legged military robot was developed by Boston Dynamics and DARPA in 2005 for equipment carrying purposes, essentially replacing the pack mules of old. Its 4-legged system would let it overcome rough terrain, and each one would have a complex onboard computer. But sometimes reality defeats innovation. The Big Dog project didn't work out for carrying military equipment because they were too loud for combat. Turns out all those moving parts aren't quiet. But this wasn't the end of the project. While the original shut down in 2015, a smaller all-electric model with a lower carrying capacity was soon introduced. And many current models are being equipped not just with carrying capacity, but with non-lethal defense capabilities. That means these robot dogs have a bite, and they might just be coming to a city near you. She's been shot at by a crazed high school psycho whose only mission in life was to murder her. Another teenager wanted her dead for the only reason that he wanted to be famous. But perhaps the most astounding assassination attempt was when a mystery figure tried to derail her train, a plot that was subsequently covered up by the government. The way old Lizzie has survived 3 assassination attempts will blow your mind. We're going to start with the most recent assassination attempt on Queen Elizabeth. The year was 1981, and she was in New Zealand fulfilling her duties as a traveling monarch. The perpetrator of the crime? A 17-year-old kid named Christopher John Lewis. You might wonder why a teen would want to blast the Queen to kingdom come, but you only need to look at his background to understand that his proverbial screw was loose. According to news reports, this boy lived in a house with a tyrannical father. Life was so chaotic for the kid that he couldn't even read or write until he was 8 years old. After assaulting another kid, he was expelled from school. He cut the heads off birds. His favorite man in the world was none other than Charles Manson. He got into petty crime while he was still young, culminating with his gang gang taking just over $5,000 from a post office after holding 2 workers at gunpoint. That was a lot of cash in the 70s, especially for a teenager. But for Lewis, the thrill from the violence was more important than the money. But he didn't stop there. He and his mates put together what they called a guerrilla army. They gave the outfit the name the National Imperial Guerrilla Army, spelling guerrilla wrong. With Lewis at the helm, they terrorized the neighborhood. Those that were close to him knew him as a bona fide psycho. As an adult, he wouldn't disagree. We know that from his memoirs, aptly titled Last Words. It was during these tumultuous years that he concocted a plan to do something to the Queen that would put his name in the history books. He later said that living with his father was a living hell, which rendered him feeling in a constant state of terror. It's hard to say why he wanted to go as far as killing the Queen, but he blamed what he called the twisted wreckage of his life and the fact that he very dearly wanted to become an outlaw. He was close to it already, feared in his town for many reasons, such as when he held up an elderly woman in her car and demanded a ride. And so on October 14, 1981, this troubled boy decided that he would take out his problems on the British monarch. At the time, she was visiting a museum in Dunedin, the town where Lewis lived. That day, he hid his .22 caliber rifle, stolen earlier from a gun shop, in a pair of old jeans and walked into a 7-story building from where he'd set up his shot. His getaway vehicle, a 10-speed bicycle, he left outside the building. Inside, he sneaked into a toilet cubicle and unwrapped his gun. He was seething with anger when he put on his gloves and readied the rifle. The Queen, he knew, would soon pass by in the street in her Rolls Royce. As the motorcade got closer, his hands trembled as he heard the cheers of the many people in the street. He stood up by the window and waited, his gun pointing toward the road. Suddenly, a loud crack was heard by many people in the crowd. The Queen had just stepped out of her car. She wasn't hurt. The shot wasn't very close. If Lewis actually meant to kill her is not certain. He later said he didn't actually want her dead, stating, "I felt that giving her a scare somehow, that the issues and problems that were evident in New Zealand might finally be brought into the public attention. And as a bonus, if the Queen would look at these issues, she might well take notice." That's not what the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service said after he'd been picked up by cops 8 days later. They believed that this kid had tried and failed. All this was actually a hush-hush and led to a cover-up because it wasn't a good look for New Zealand. But this cover-up doesn't even come close to what you'll see later. When he was charged, all the public heard was that his crime was illegally possessing a firearm and illegally discharging one, not that he had tried to kill the Queen. As we said, people in the crowd that day had heard gunshots, but cops later assured them and some curious journalists that it was nothing but an unrelated racket. When Lewis heard the charges in court, his words were, "Only 2 charges? What? Had the bullet hit her, would it be treason?" But the whole story remained classified until February 2018 when a media company found out the truth. By this time, Lewis was long since dead. His death is a grim story if there ever was one. After the incident, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. There, he once pulled a knife on a guard, and in his spare time, he concocted another plan to take out Prince Charles. After his release, he wrote these memoirs, and while he did try to stay away from crime, intelligence services never let him out of their sights. They thought he was still dangerous, knowing that if he had a more powerful gun that day, he could well have killed the Queen. That's why in 1995, when the Queen was visiting New Zealand again, they exiled him to Great Barrier Island for an expenses-paid 14-day vacation. As a friend of his once said, he always wanted to know what it would be like to take someone's life. The next year, Lewis was accused of doing just that after a mother of 3 named Tanya Furlan was found dead in her house, her head smashed by a hammer. Lewis was accused of the murder and of kidnapping her child in an effort to secure a ransom, but the evidence against him was weak to say the least. Cops had listened to an informant, a friend of Lewis's, and he told them that Lewis had killed the woman. From his jail cell, Lewis wrote, "I stand firm in my convictions that the present nightmare will soon be over. I know in my heart that I didn't commit these crimes, so this is all the hope I need for myself." It's very likely he wasn't guilty, and the culprit was probably that informant, a man who later committed a similar murder. But Lewis didn't get to clear his name. He was electrocuted in his prison cell before his case went to trial. What's amazing about that story is the fact that Lewis really could have killed the Queen. There's no doubt about it. It's also fascinating that no one but the royals and some chosen authorities knew about it. With this next young chap, his assassination attempt was never going to hurt the Queen much, but it was spectacular in itself. It happened again in the same year on June 13, 1981. This time the Queen was on home turf, and again, her would-be assassin was just 17 years old. His name was Marcus Sargent. On the day, he managed to get off 6 bullets as the Queen was riding a horse through central London for what's called the Trooping the Colour ceremony. That day, the crowds filled the street as the soon-to-be-married Diana Spencer rode in a carriage with Prince Andrew. Her lover and future husband, Prince Charles, like the Queen, rode on horseback. Sargent didn't have anything near the psychological problems that our first assassin had. He was a Boy Scout who'd done pretty well in school, and as a youth, he'd won awards for marksmanship at the Air Training Corps, a kind of cadet school for young folks. But then Then, at the age of 16, things started to go wrong for him. He joined the British Royal Marines but left after a few months for what he later said was bullying. He then joined the army and only managed to get through 2 days of induction. To add to this list of failures, he was also turned down by the police and the fire brigade. Angry and disappointed in himself, he ended up working at a zoo. At age 17, he was out of work again, and he'd taken upon himself to become a member of an anti-royalist group. Things could have really gone badly for the Queen if this young lad hadn't failed in finding ammunition for his pop's .455 Webley revolver. He tried in vain to get his hands on another gun, but as you know, it's not easy in England. Even though Sargent joined a gun club to get himself a license, it seems he gave up on trying to buy a real gun and instead paid about $80 for 2 blank-firing replica Colt Python revolvers that were sent to him via mail. If he couldn't kill her, he was damn well gonna scare her. Not long before he did the deed, he actually sent a letter to Buckingham Palace stating, "Your Majesty, don't go on the trooping color ceremony because there was an assassin set up to kill you waiting just outside the palace." The letter arrived 3 days after the ceremony. As she rode on her horse, Sargent seemed to appear from nowhere and fired off 6 shots. Needless to say, this shocked and scared onlookers. No bullets came out of the gun, of course, but the noise frightened the Queen's horse, named Burmese, and it reared up a little. Like a champ, she steadied the beast. Guardsmen and cops were on Sargent like a flash, and the Queen, according to one of her bodyguards, rode on as cool as a cucumber. He told the press she looked shaken by the episode, but soon recovered her composure. Sargent was charged with the 1848 Treason Act and sentenced to 5 years in prison. It turned out that this failure of a kid had been obsessed with the assassinations of John Lennon and John F. Kennedy. When investigators unearthed his diary, one of the entries read, "I'm going to stun and mystify the whole world with nothing more than a gun. I will become the most famous teenager in the world." He didn't deny it later, telling the cops to their face, "I wanted to be famous. I wanted to be a somebody." Psychiatrists didn't think he had any kind of severe mental health issues, saying he was merely a messed up, insecure kid who'd studied the Lennon assassination and couldn't believe how easy it had been. He thought, why not? I would like to be the first one to take a pot shot at the Queen. He was released from prison at the age of 20, and due to him being disliked by a lot of royal-loving Brits, he gave himself a new identity. All the time he'd been locked up, he apparently sent letters to the Queen apologizing for what he'd done. She didn't reply once. We can't tell you what happened in the end to this boy that was called by the media a traitor and a fantasy assassin, but we reckon he sure would have been looked on with interest had the truth about the Queen's later visit to New Zealand had been told. And that brings us to another cover-up, easily the strangest tale of the 3 assassination attempts. Like the New Zealand attempt on her life, the story only became public knowledge many years after the event. In 1970, she was on a royal tour of Australia. On the 29th of April, she was riding a train with her husband Prince Philip, heading from Sydney to the city of Orange, a distance of about 161 miles. The incident happened close to the town of Lithgow, population of 13,000. We now know that prior to her boarding that train, someone had laid down a large log on the tracks. At around 7 feet long and about 8 inches in diameter, it was big enough to derail the train. Someone had obviously left it there in the dark, and they'd wedged it in enough so that it would do some serious damage. In fact, the train did hit that log and was momentarily shaken. But it just happened that at the moment, the train had been going much slower than usual. Had it been traveling at the usual speed, there is every chance it could have derailed, and the Queen been seriously injured or killed. A report written many years later said the train continued on brakes for about 200 meters with the log still wedged under the front wheels before finally coming to a halt at the level crossing near Bowenfell Station. As things turned out, the Queen didn't know a thing about it. The Australian cops didn't report the matter, and a local newspaper that knew what had happened made a so-called gentleman's agreement with the cops not to publish the story and so embarrass them and the country. The newspaper, the Lithgow Mercury, kept hold of the story for close to 40 years. One of the investigators later admitted he'd pulled the editor to the side and told him not to publish the story. He said, "I took him for a drive and I told him the story and I said, I want your assurance that you don't print it." And he didn't print it. In 2009, it was finally published. For many years, Australian cops investigated the plot, but nothing came of it. One of the reasons for that was because they couldn't actually talk to many people about what had happened. The lead investigator recalled, "We never came up with any decent suspects because if we interviewed people, we seemed to be talking in riddles. Who is behind the plot remains a mystery, with IRA sympathizers being high on the list of suspects. Still, it could have been another kid trying to make a name for himself or just a regular run-of-the-mill loon." It seems Buckingham Palace had also been kept in the dark all those years, although it's possible the British authorities also kept the story under wraps. In 2009, the palace issued a statement saying it didn't want to comment on the matter, but in the royal diary there was no mention of anything strange happening on the train that day. Here are 50 insane facts about pain that will make you cringe and want to curl up in the fetal position. Number 50. Your extremities are the most sensitive to pain compared to the rest of your body. These places are your fingertips, forehead, shins, the arch of your foot, and your knees. Number 49. This is why it hurts so much when you step on a Lego brick. You have 200,000 sensory receptors in your feet, and most of them get fired up when you make that fateful step. These receptors tell you so much information about how you're walking, standing, or how hot and cold the floor is. Number 48. There are some people in the world who don't feel any pain. They suffer from something called congenital analgesia. Number 47. Pain might actually shrink the brain, the chronic kind anyway. One study showed that people's brains with chronic backache were 11% smaller on average than the general population's. Number 46. If you think you feel more pain than the average person, you might not be 100% wrong. Pain is everywhere. About 75 million people in the USA live with chronic pain. Ouch! Number 45. There was a man. He was a hardy kind of fella, but in 1995 when he was at work on his construction site, a building site in his native England, something reduced him to howls and tears. He jumped right onto a long nail that went straight through his boot. The young man yelped in agony. He even kept screaming while the doctors filled his veins with the best opiates available to mankind. The pain he managed to get out was excruciating. After the drugs started to take effect, the doctors managed to see the damage. The nail went through the middle of the man's toes. There were 0 injuries to his body. And that's not even the strangest case of pain on this list. Number 44. There's a scientific explanation for the man's case. Researchers have pointed out that, like in many other cases, the man's senses believed that that nail had gone through his foot. As one of them put it, thoughts, beliefs, and emotions, including panic and fear, set off a cascade of biological and neurochemical processes. His brain, synthesizing the sum total of this information, decided that he was in danger, so it made pain to protect him. He believed there was pain, so he felt pain. As weird as that might sound to you, as you'll see later in the show, maybe we can help ourselves when it comes to pain. This story is equally strange. Number 43. Surprisingly enough, we are returning to another construction site. This guy was using a rather powerful nail gun when it accidentally fired. He felt something in his face, but he didn't worry too much about it and just got on with the job. Life went on. Then 6 days later, he was at the dentist. He still felt fine. The dentist, though, had some bad news for him. An x-ray showed there was a large nail in his head. The nail had dangerously hit his brain's cerebral cortex. Of course, he needed medical help after that. In this case, because the man's senses told him everything was okay, he ended up feeling no pain. Now for something a bit more ordinary, but it's something you ought to know. Number 42. Some of you would likely vote for having a pain-free life, but if you felt no pain, you'd be in trouble. You feel pain because the nerves in your body are telling your brain there is something wrong. You can then fix whatever's wrong. So pain, just like a good cop, is trying its best to keep you alive. Number 41. Only a few hundred folks in the world can't feel pain, and we can tell you that they wish things were different. Feeling no pain is a huge downer. Take the case of Stefan Betz, who, when he was interviewed by the BBC back in 2017, was a 21-year-old university student in Germany. The BBC said this guy could put his hand in a bowl of boiling water and not feel a thing. Pain for him was totally absent from his life. He really hated the fact that this was his reality. Imagine being him during childhood, when he was always having accidents and he didn't even know he was injured. He broke a foot and didn't feel anything. One time he even bit off some of his tongue and only knew about it because of the blood. Number 40. Pain can have its positives, though, as a scientist named Dr. Brock Bastian discovered. He did a series of tests where he put people through pain. In groups, participants did things such as eat hot chili peppers and immerse their hands for a long time in ice water. They didn't know what this experiment was about, of course. What the doctor found out was that this control group and other pain groups later worked really well together on certain challenges, better than the groups who had not earlier suffered together. The pain, it seems, brought them together. Number 39. It's often said the worst insect sting comes from the bullet ant, called that because its sting feels like being shot. A well-known entomologist named Justin O. Schmidt actually developed a pain index of all pain-inducing critters, and he put the bullet ant in first place. This is what he said about the sting. It's like walking over flaming charcoal with a 3-inch nail embedded in your heel. It's also been described as causing waves of burning, throbbing, all-consuming pain that continues unabated for up to 24 hours. You might not believe it, but some people will willingly put themselves through pain. Number 38. The Satere Mawe tribe of Brazil have an initiation ceremony for boys who are ready to become warriors. It involves putting your hands into a glove full of bullet ants and some sadist blowing smoke into the glove to enrage the ants. Some of the kids apparently shake for a day and can't use their hands at all. The pain must be unimaginable. They need to go through about 20 of these ceremonies before they're accepted as grown men capable of doing a bit of warrioring. Number 37. The stonefish is another baddie of the animal world that can make your day much worse. They look like a stone, as the name suggests, so they get stepped on from time to time. As that happens, the pain is immense, and it could be lethal if not treated with antivenom. A sting has been described as causing irregular heartbeat, temporary paralysis, shock, extreme pain, and possibly death. Stay away from stones on the beach, guys, but we really should be telling Australians more than most people. Number 36. You probably want to know what people say is the worst pain in the world. We won't tell you that just yet, but we will tell you that cluster headaches are up there. Here's how some people have described them. I will never forget the sheer and sudden agony which woke me up in the early hours of the morning. Someone jabbed a white-hot poker into your eye socket and is holding it there for 45 minutes to an hour and a half. Number 35. The brain doesn't actually feel pain. It's the nerves that send the signals back to the brain so the brain can react. Number 34. But also, the brain itself doesn't have nerves. It's surrounded by nerves, but there are none inside it. That's why a surgeon could wield a scalpel in there and the patient wouldn't feel any pain at all. Number 33. It seems women feel more pain than men in general. One scientist said, on average, women report the same stimuli to be more painful than men. He added, the burden of pain is substantially greater for women than men, and that led pain researchers like myself to wonder if the pain perception system is different in women than in men. But why? Number 32. That is the billion-dollar question, because how can you actually measure pain? You can't, but you can measure people's response to it. Researchers don't really know why women seem to feel more pain. Some of them think it could be about hormones or perhaps a woman's increased susceptibility to things like depression and sadness. Now for something we all face, and most of you know about it. Number 31. Some of you know there are toothaches, and then there are toothaches. If you've ever had a severe toothache where the tooth gets infected, you'll know that it's one of the most horrible things in the world. You literally feel like pulling out your own tooth. Well, during lockdown, some people couldn't get to a dentist, so they decided to do the dentistry themselves. One man who successfully went through this process said, the pain was excruciating, but the main thing was the whole left-hand side of my face was swelling up. Every half hour it was getting bigger. I looked like the Elephant Man. With the help of his 12-year-old son and some household tools, they managed to get the tooth out in about an hour and a half. He said the relief was instantaneous, although such ad hoc dentistry is not advisable. Okay, some quick-fire facts now. Number 30. 25 million Americans experience those terrible things called migraines. Number 29. 1 in every 6 Americans suffers from arthritis. Number 28. This is good news for companies that sell medications for pain relief. The global pain relief market is said to be around $50 billion. Number 27. You might have heard something about the opioid crisis in the USA. One of the main reasons that happened is because a company called Purdue managed to pass one of their drugs, OxyContin, as not being addictive. It was, and still is, and it's basically heroin. Good heroin. Number 26. Scientists, though, still don't understand pain very well. This is why it's hard to just stop someone's pain. As one expert said, pain is complex and defies our ability to establish a clear definition. Pain is far more than neural transmission and sensory transduction. Pain is a complex mixture of emotions, culture, experience, spirit, and sensation. Number 25. That's because a drug like Tylenol blocks an enzyme that produces a chemical compound called prostaglandins. These are things that cause inflammation and swelling. That's the theory, anyway. It's still up for debate. There's no buzz, so it's not as abused. That doesn't mean it's not dangerous. In some cases, it can cause liver damage, usually when it's taken over the amount prescribed or after a lot of daily use. In the US, there are about 500 deaths a year as a result of Tylenol and acetaminophen, as well as 56,000 visits to the ER. Number 24. Cancer is a terrible disease to have. But did you know that a lot of time it comes without any pain? Many people have gotten a diagnosis and soon after die. This is why. Number 23. The tumor itself doesn't have nerves. It's only when the nerves nearby get compressed by the tumor that the person might feel something. According to cancer experts, only 38% of those who suffer from cancer have moderate to severe pain. Number 22. It can be the same with liver disease. For instance, some people might eat badly or drink way too much booze, and their liver could start to scar, and the scarring could get so bad that the person gets end-stage liver disease. Once they've been told that, sometimes they don't have long left. But during all those years of scarring, even when the liver was like leather, they might not have felt any pain. That's why the liver is called the silent organ. You'd think we'd have been designed better because in the vast majority of cases, the early scarring is completely reversible. Number 21. You might have wondered in your life if it hurts when you get shot. Well, it all depends on where you get shot. The pain can be mild enough so some folks don't even know they've been hit. The pain can also be severe. Thankfully, we have some survivor statements. Here's what some of them said. I heard the gunshot and felt a tight pressure in my arm. I looked and saw the wound and how much blood I was losing, and the next thing I know, I'm in the hospital. I was shot with an AK-47 to the leg. Felt like a baseball bat hit me, but no pain. This was followed by a buzzing feeling for 5 to 10 seconds, then the severe achy pain set in. As you'll now see, drowning can be painful too, but not for everyone. Number 20. One person said about drowning, "I actually realized that I was going to drown, so I breathed the water in on purpose just to get it over with. It only hurt when I was coughing it up." Yet another person said after they let go and allowed the water in, "My lungs had more or less given out and there was no pain, just comfort." Another person said when she swallowed the water, it burnt like hell. So drowning seems to be a mixed bag. As you'll now see, sometimes it can take some time for pain to come. Number 19. In 2008, ABC News reported about a Utah photojournalist who'd been photographing a javelin event when he was hit in the leg. It went right through to the other side. He later said it wasn't really painful. Doctors told ABC that in many traumatic injuries, the person might not feel the immediate impact of the pain. Some of you might have a broken leg only to get right up, but then not long after collapse again when the pain finally kicks in. One of the doctors interviewed explained, when a severe injury happens, the body's adrenal glands secrete epinephrine, a hormone that then increases blood pressure and heart rate, which helps the person suffering the injury run away or stay alive. Again, your body is looking out for you. Number 18. As for the dreaded root canal, they don't hurt, even though they scare a lot of people. It's what comes before the root canal that hurts. Now for one of your biggest nightmares. Number 17. Can you imagine waking up in the middle of surgery? That shouldn't happen because if it looks like you're waking up a bit, you'll just be given extra sedation. But there is something called anesthesia awareness where the sedation doesn't work. Luckily, it's rare and it only happens to about 1 or 2 in 1,000 people. Usually, the worst part of the awareness is seeing what's going on, which in some cases could lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. Still, worse things have happened. Number 16. This happened to a Canadian woman named Donna Penner when she woke up during her abdominal surgery. She told the BBC, "I panicked. I thought this cannot be happening. So I waited for a few seconds, but then I felt him make the first incision. I don't have words to describe the pain. It was horrific. I could not open my eyes. The first thing that I tried to do was sit up, but I couldn't move." She said she could feel the surgeon moving something around in her organs, which, as you can imagine, caused her a lot of stress. She survived, and the surgeon later went on to her room and said there'd been some problems. She thought, "No kidding." And I told him, "I was awake. I felt you cutting me." She said his eyes filled with tears and he said, "I'm so sorry." We imagine you hated that story just as much as you liked it, but let's stick with the horror for now. Number 15. You've all seen those movies depicting old times when someone has a leg amputated, and of course there's no anesthetic. There's just the Hollywood trope of putting a stick in the mouth and a glug of whiskey. How real is that? Amputation goes back a long way, to the famous Arab Andalusian surgeon and father of modern surgery, Al-Zahrawi. When he was around over 1,000 years ago, he wrote, "Sometimes the extremities become gangrenous. You must cut off that limb as far as the disease has spread so that the patient may escape death or greater affliction, greater than the loss of the limb." Number 14. But people were having limbs amputated a long time before that. It's written that Queen Vishbla, a warrior queen mentioned in the Hindu ancient texts, was wounded in battle sometime around 1200 BC. She then had an iron prosthetic leg fitted. The question is, did it hurt? Number 13. Yes, it did, and a lot. Captain James Cook wrote in 1685 that a man on his ship had to have his leg amputated. Cook wrote, "Dismembering is a dreadful operation, yet necessary that the dead part may not injure the living, nor procure death." He went on to describe the procedure, adding that the patient was given some alcohol before a knife was used to cut around the gangrene. The next step was using a saw to cut away the bone. This part had to be done perfectly and fast, so there would always be another saw on standby in case the first one broke. The British Medical Journal, where we found the story, said many early accounts state that speed was the only pain relief. It added, yet however fast the amputation, the devastating intensity of the agony remained. Number 12. Not surprisingly, people in those days would sometimes pass out during such an operation, something the doctors didn't want to happen because they thought alertness made the process more successful. The reason you faint when you experience sudden massive pain is because something called the vasovagal syncope triggers, and that leads to a sudden drop in blood pressure and heart rate. With less blood flow to the brain, you pass out. Number 11. A question you're all dying for us to answer is it possible to block out pain? Some of you might have seen a famous photograph of a Buddhist monk in the street on fire, and it looks as though he's okay with it. In fact, someone who saw it remarked as he burned, he never moved a muscle, never uttered a sound. His face seemed to remain fairly calm until it was so blackened by the flames that you couldn't make it out anymore. Could you do that? Possibly when you have one of those terrible toothaches. Number 10. Probably not, because you can't reach a state of deep meditation. Some people have written that if you can get to such a stage, you might be able to suffer tremendous physical pain without flinching. Now for some good news. Number 9. Studies have shown that with the help of meditation, even if you're a novice, you can at least reduce pain. We know that because neuroscientists measured people's brains using imaging scans. One of those scientists concluded a little over an hour of meditation training can dramatically reduce both experience of pain and pain-related brain activation. This next one is just as amazing. Number 8. A Nobel Prize-winning scientist named Daniel Kahneman was very interested in pain, so he conducted a pain experiment. He took a bunch of participants and asked them to put their hand in a bucket of icy water. One time the temperature was 14 degrees Celsius and the time in the water was 60 seconds. In the other trial, the water and the temperature were the same, but then he warmed the water to 15 degrees Celsius and added another 30 seconds. After being put through both trials, 70% of the people said they would prefer the second option, stating that it was way less painful. The reason they actually chose the worst trial is because people generally remember the last thing that's happened to them more clearly. Okay, now let's talk about execution. Number 7. There was a German executioner named Franz Schmidt who wrote a diary about his executions, which were turned into a book. He executed 361 people until he retired in 1617. The form of killing was either hanging, beheading, or the worst, being broken on the wheel. The least painful, he said, was beheading. He'd often give the person some alcohol, but not so much they couldn't stay straight for his axe. He'd also said that if the crowd really hated a person, a killer perhaps, when he broke them on the wheel, he'd start at the feet and work his way up. If the crowd wanted mercy, he'd start with the head. Number 6. Over in China, sometimes the condemned could bribe the executioner to ensure the process went smoothly. In that country, flaying was sometimes the form of execution, which was incredibly painful. In some cases, just the face would be flayed, which might not have killed someone immediately, but death was likely around the corner. There are a number of reasons for death in flaying, with one being shock and loss of blood, both of which might kill someone fairly fast. Even if they survived the initial punishment, they'd likely die soon enough from an infection or even hypothermia. We can't really imagine anything more brutal, although, as you know, we've tried. Number 5. Now we need to talk about ghosts. There is something you might not have heard of called phantom pain. It can be seriously painful. The strange thing is, the pain is coming from a part of the body that isn't there. So a person might have lost an arm, but every day they feel excruciating pain where the arm was. In the past, doctors thought the pain was purely psychological, but now they believe phantom pain is the result of nervous system signals getting mixed up. Number 4. Let's now talk about pain relief through the ages. In the 1600s in Europe, the use of opium became very popular for pain management. In the 1800s, they discovered that chloroform was a good anesthetic. The ancient Greeks might have used certain herbs as well as opium for various kinds of pain, but we like something the ancient Egyptians used to do from time to time. That was to collect electric eels out of the Nile and lay them on people for the reason that the electric discharge could relieve pain from inflammation. The ancient Greek physician, the great Hippocrates, would sometimes use torpedo fish to relieve folks of their headache or gout. These fish are a kind of electric ray. The Roman physician Scribonius Largus also prescribed a few shocks with one of those fish to cure chronic headaches. So we have to ask, can pain actually feel good? Number 3. We know some of you enjoy pulling off scabs even though it hurts a little bit, or perhaps some savages out there are partial to ripping your nasal hairs out. It can feel kind of nice in a bad way. Some scientists have said that when pain is not as bad as we expected it to be, we can actually enjoy the pain. But many people put themselves through pain all the time, whether it involves extreme exercise or someone whipping them across their leather-clad face. In these circumstances, we can produce our very own brand of narcotics, what scientists call endorphins, which not only block pain, but in some cases give us a post-pain rush similar to the high of morphine or heroin. But sometimes pain is some plain old pain, such as when it's the worst pain in the world. Number 2. It's called trigeminal neuralgia and is frequently called the worst pain humans can face. It's actually described as feeling like an electric shock going through the face that can last seconds or up to 2 minutes. These can come out of the blue and can happen to anyone. Although science is still trying to figure them out, it's almost certain they occur due to something called the trigeminal nerve. This is part of the nervous system that sends messages from the face to the brain. For some reason not yet fully understood, something goes wrong and pain happens. Intense pain, described by some sufferers as fireworks in your face or red-hot needles being poked in the face. One man said, "I wanted to rip my head open to get out whatever was in there." It can ruin your life, as those who experience this frequently are unable to perform basic tasks such as eating or speaking. So with that in mind, as you sit comfortably in your chair watching this show, just take a second to realize that things aren't so bad. Number 1. Now we must ask, does a broken heart actually hurt? The answer is yes, it can. There is something called broken heart syndrome, and it can happen after a person's been through a lot of stress, sometimes emotional stress. This can cause the heart muscles to weaken, cause chest pain that could lead to heart failure. It's unlikely, but extreme mental pain could cause you a lot of physical pain. Anyone who's ever visited a jail knows it's not exactly the most comfortable place in the world. That's why the American judicial system has the institution of bail, a deposit to the court made in either cash or collateral that allows a person to purchase their freedom while preparing for and undergoing trial. Around 40% of criminal defendants are ultimately released on bail. For defendants who can't afford to post their own bail, there's a person called a bail bondsman. Bail bondsmen work for private LLCs and front these people a portion of the money for their bail, which are called surety bonds, and typically charge a fee for doing so. Though the amount of the fee varies from bondsman to bondsman, the standard fee is 10%. Under this system, if a defendant agrees to the terms set forth by the bail bondsman, in order to win their freedom, they're essentially handing over power of attorney for themselves to the bail bondsman. This means that if they fail to appear in court on the scheduled date or try to skip town, the bail bondsman has the right to track them down and haul them in. But the bail bondsmen don't undertake this task themselves. They often hire bounty hunters, also known as bail enforcement agents or recovery agents, to track the defendant down on their behalf. But what's it like being a bounty hunter? What are the rules and laws that typically govern bounty hunters? And is it as badass of a job as their job title suggests? Bounty hunting is a vestige of British common law of the Middle Ages. As we discussed in a previous video, what is bail money actually for? England was the place in which the rule of law replaced what we now consider to be more archaic forms of dispensing justice, like determining if your neighbor stole your garden rake by seeing if their head resembled a pumpkin that everyone knew was haunted. Instead of cash or collateral goods, bail often took the form of an actual person, which meant that a friend or family member would put themselves forward as vouching for the person accused of the crime. 13th century courts often required the person doing the vouching to serve the punishment of the defendant if that person skipped town, which could sometimes mean a death sentence. Fast forward to the modern era, and bounty hunters primarily draw their legal imprimatur from an 1872 Supreme Court decision, Taylor v. Tainter, which stated that bounty hunters may pursue a fugitive to another state, arrest him on the Sabbath, and if necessary break and enter his house for that purpose. Bounty hunters are typically paid a commission of the total bail amount that's owed by the fugitive. So, for example, if a person can't afford bail that's set at $10,000, they would typically pay a portion of that amount in cash or collateral plus a fee to the bail bondsman. Then the bail bondsman pays the rest of the amount, which is backed by insurance. However, the bail bondsman only gets their money back if the person who was released on bail actually shows up to court. If that person skips their court date or leaves town, it's the bail bondsman who's on the hook for the full bail amount. If the bail bondsman winds up having to pay the full amount because the defendant hasn't appeared in court, that's called a forfeiture. If the bail bondsman can produce the person who skipped out, a person referred to as a skip, then the bail bondsman is given the entire bail amount plus the initial fee that they charged to the skip for providing the bail money in the first place. In other words, if the skip is successfully apprehended and brought back to court, the skip loses the amount that they initially put up in cash or collateral. In those cases in which a person has skipped town, the bondsman hires a bounty hunter to track the person down and even apprehend them. But since bounty hunters are independent contractors and work on commission, they only get paid if they're able to find the skip and bring them in. There isn't a verifiable way to count the number of bounty hunters in the United States. No central database exists, and state laws vary widely as to the legality of the practice. Multiple states, such as Oregon, Kentucky, and Illinois, have banned the practice of bounty hunting altogether. Other states, such as Wyoming, are on the other end of the spectrum, with few, if any, rules governing the practice at all. However, according to an estimate by an industry organization called the Professional Bail Agents of the United States, the total number of bounty hunters in the U.S. numbers around 15,000. That's a lot of bounty hunting going on. But what kinds of rules and regulations do bounty hunters have to follow? One rule of all bounty hunting is they are not allowed to cross country lines. Bounty hunters who attempted to apprehend fugitives in another country face dangerous consequences, and even a trip over the border to Canada to snatch a fugitive would violate international law. When it comes to the tactics bounty hunters employ to catch fugitives, it turns out that they can get away with quite a lot. Bounty hunters operate outside of the traditional legal constraints that govern police officers and other agents of the state. This is because a bail agreement between a defendant and a bail bondsman is essentially a civil contract that is incumbent upon the bondsman to enforce. As a result, bounty hunters hired by bail bondsmen enjoy significant legal privileges that everyday police officers do not. For example, when bounty hunters are making an arrest, they're not required to read a defendant their Miranda rights. Bounty hunters also may enter a defendant's home without probable cause or a search warrant, but only if they've established that the fugitive is actually living there. In other words, bounty hunters do not have the right to enter the homes of the fugitive's friends or family to look for the person. Depending on the state, bounty hunters may also not be required to obtain a license or undergo training. All bounty hunters really need in order to make an arrest is a copy of the bail piece, which is a copy of the paperwork proving that the person that they're hunting is indeed a fugitive. Some states also require that the bounty hunters possess a copy of the actual bond. And because bounty hunters may carry firearms and handcuffs and may even use deadly force when attempting to apprehend fugitives, there's a great potential for things to go awry. And that's what happened in 2003 when a Virginia bounty hunter named James Howard Dickerson entered the wrong house and shot dead a man named Roberto Martinez after Martinez tried to escape. The unfortunate case led Virginia to introduce a rush of new regulations on bounty hunters. The potential for disaster has led many states to adopt stricter requirements for those who wish to become bounty hunters. For starters, many states require that applicants be above a certain age, say between 18 to 25, and complete a course or set of courses within 90 days of receiving their license. Another common requirement is for applicants to have had no misdemeanor or felony convictions within the past 5 to 10 years. And this makes sense. If you're going to hire someone who enjoys extra legal privileges and likely carries a gun, you probably don't want someone with a history of committing serious or violent crimes. When drilling down into state regulations around the bounty hunting industry, some are more stringent than others. Some, like North Dakota, look to protect against potential conflicts of interest. According to state regulations, those looking to become bounty hunters must not hold a position as a jailer, police officer, magistrate court judge, sheriff, sheriff's deputy, or any other individual having arresting authority. This makes sense, too. You could see confusion arising from someone justifying illegal search and seizure as a cop by saying that they were actually acting in their capacity as a bounty hunter, and it would be difficult to prove that they were acting illegally. Mississippi has similar requirements. State law indicates that those seeking licensure as a bail enforcement agent may not be employed as an attorney, law enforcement agent, or judicial official, and may not be employed as a correctional officer in a facility where inmates are bailable. Some state laws around the industry pay particular attention to applicants' personal behavior. In Iowa, for example, people looking to become bounty hunters must have no history of domestic violence or drug and alcohol abuse. And in Georgia, in addition to its requirements around age, felony convictions, and U.S. citizenship, the state also requires that prospective bounty hunters be eligible to carry a firearm. Then there's the issue of temperament. Media depictions like the popular reality TV show Dog the Bounty Hunter portray an industry full of cowboy-type bounty hunters who shoot from the hip, are regularly shot at, and engage in high-speed chases to apprehend their fugitives. In reality, bail bond agencies are far more likely to hire individuals who are low-key and understated for the role of a bounty hunter. It is, after all, a private company. If they're known for employing people who regularly shoot people or engage in cavalier behavior, it makes it less likely that people would want to solicit that company's services. In this case, people who are already in a stressful situation because they're facing a court hearing. It's also an insurance issue. Any of the bounty hunters who injure someone or put lives at risk could potentially be costing the company a great deal of money. And perhaps most importantly, one of the most distinct advantages that a bounty hunter has in his or her pursuit of a fugitive is the element of surprise. If a bounty hunter is constantly being loud and drawing attention to himself, he is likely to miss out on opportunities to apprehend his skip, which would make the bail bond agencies that much less inclined to hire him. The issue of liability makes clear that while there are some privileges that bounty hunters are allowed to exploit, there are still many things that bounty hunters are unequivocally not allowed to do. First and foremost, bounty hunters are not police officers, and any attempt by a bounty hunter to pass themselves off as a police officer is illegal. This appears to be a not uncommon occurrence. A man in the Bronx was recently arrested for being reportedly decked out in a bulletproof vest, pepper spray, 2 radios, and an expandable baton, a folding knife, and a BB gun holstered in his nylon gun belt. Establishing a clear delineation between who is a cop and who is a bounty hunter is important. When an everyday citizen is approached by a bounty hunter, they're not required to answer his or her questions and are not allowed to be detained. As a result, many bounty hunters refer to themselves as agents, as in bail enforcement agents or fugitive recovery agents. Yet, even with these boundaries in place, bounty hunters may still engage in practices that are considered questionable or even legally troublesome by law enforcement officials. For example, one Idaho bounty hunter was met with angry responses from law enforcement after live streaming his capturing of a fugitive and for a separate incident in which he asked the public for tips regarding a murder case. While not technically illegal, these practices arguably infringe upon the civil liberties of the fugitives and could endanger lives if things went wrong. Now, while all of this may sound frightening and make civil libertarians angry, there are reasons why the system exists. For starters, it's effective. According to a book by two economists that compare public and private law enforcement practices, the surety bond system has lower rates of people skipping out on their court dates than all the other forms of pretrial release. On top of that, bounty hunters have an astonishingly high capture rate, which sits anywhere from 85 to 99%. While the reasons for this rate of success may vary, it probably comes down to bounty hunters enjoying significantly more legal leeway than regular cops, and the fact that bounty hunters have a financial incentive to capture their man. Another reason why the bounty hunter model continues is because it makes people money. The fact that around 15,000 people benefit financially from being bounty hunters gives them an incentive to keep the system in place, regardless of whether it's fair. That's not to say that there hasn't been significant pushback on the part of activists and concerned citizens who say that the cash bail system is morally and legally repugnant, and that while bounty hunters may be effective in rounding up the tiny percentage of the population who have skipped out on their financial obligations, they represent a far greater threat to the safety and liberty of everyday citizens.
World War I officially started on July 28, 1914, and ended on November 11, 1918. The number of casualties differs depending on what source you read, and finding exact numbers is of course impossible. It's generally thought this devastating war involving multiple nations ended with about 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded. 10 million of those deaths were civilian deaths, and 9.7 million of them were military personnel. It's said the Entente powers, also called the Allies, lost around 5.7 million soldiers, and the Central powers lost somewhere in the region of 4 million. As the Robert Schuman Center tells us, many of the overall deaths were not related to actual fighting, but to famine, disease, and genocide. Welcome to this episode of the Infographics Show, 50 Shocking Facts About World War I. Number 50, the Allies. Before we talk about details many of our viewers might not know, we have to spend a bit of time on the basics. Who was involved, for instance? Well, it started with Austria-Hungary and Serbia declaring war on each other. Soon after, other countries got involved. As we already said, there were the Allies and the Central Powers. The main allies were the French Republic, the British Empire, and the Russian Empire. Italy changed sides and joined the Allies. The USA declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917. These were the main players on the Allied side, but backing them up were the countries of Belgium, Brazil, Greece, Montenegro, Romania, Japan, and Serbia. Please note that we have stated empires, which consisted of various other nations. If you go to the Cook Islands, you'll find a memorial with a list of its soldiers that fell in the war. Or you can look at a similar list of people who came from India and died in the war, and it's a very long one. For instance, 1.4 million Indians served, while 629,000 Canadians did. The empire where the sun never set was vast. Number 49. The Central Powers. The Central Powers' main players were Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Then there were what were called co-belligerents and German client states. The main co-belligerents were the Dervish State, a Somali Muslim kingdom, the South African Republic, and the Sultanate of Darfur. Number 48. Who died? It's said that Germany mobilized 13,250,000 soldiers. 66% of them ended up as casualties, and 1.8 million of them ended up injured or in the ground. Over 20 million Russians served, and around 11.8 million, or 56% of them, died or got injured. These numbers are highly disputed. 6.2 million Brits went to war, and 886,000 of them didn't come back. 41% of those Brits died or were hurt in the war. The French sent 8.4 million people to war, and 1.4 million soldiers died. 67% of French soldiers were injured or died. The USA sent 4.3 million soldiers to war, and 53,000 of them didn't come back. 5.9% of American soldiers were hurt or died. 74,000 Indians from almost 1.5 million soldiers died in the war. 650,000 Italians from over 5.6 million soldiers died. 62,000 Australian soldiers died, and 65,000 Canadians died. Romania was also badly hit, with 250,000 of its soldiers not coming back from the war.
It was almost the same situation for Serbia, which lost 275,000 soldiers. We can't go through every country, unfortunately, as it would just take too long, but these countries suffered the worst in terms of military losses. The USA also suffered in an entirely original way, but we are keeping that fact for the number 1 spot. Number 47, a chain reaction. Okay, now that we have some of those basic facts over with, let's talk about more obscure things. Some people say one man was the catalyst for the beginning of the war. His name was Gavrilo Princip, the Bosnian Serb who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife. He said after he was arrested, "I am a Yugoslav nationalist aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs, and I do not care what form of state, but it must be freed from Austria." He obviously had no idea this would start a war, and then a world war. Number 46, always read the use-by date. After the assassination, Mr. Princip didn't fancy a life in jail, so he swallowed a cyanide pill. However, this only made him feel sick because it said the pill was out of date. The 19-year-old also tried to shoot himself, but his gun was taken from him. Talk about an ill-starred life. He was then sent to prison where conditions were so awful he got very sick, lost a limb, and died looking not much different from a skeleton. Number 45. Trenches. So you probably know this already, but much of the war was fought in trenches. On the Western Front, you had many of these things, and millions of soldiers lived in them. Sometimes the opposing armies were not even that far apart, with the space between them being called no man's land. Of that space, one historian writes, on the Western Front, it was typically between 100 and 300 yards, though only 30 yards on Vimy Ridge. Number 44. Trench feet. Standing inside dirty, muddy, often rain-soaked trenches was hard on the feet, or you could say soft on the feet. Many soldiers developed what became known as trench foot. You could also call it zombie foot, as that is what it might look like. Sometimes it would become gangrenous, and the foot would have to be amputated. Number 43. Dogs. The British love their dogs, and during the war, some people in the UK donated their canines to the war effort. Dogs could run around the battlefield and carry messages, and they were hard to shoot. Smaller dogs were also great at catching rats in the trenches. Believe it or not, there were what was called casualty dogs. These dogs would run around the battlefield with medical supplies tied to them so injured soldiers could be helped. They were like little four-legged ambulances. Number 42. Jackie. South African soldiers took a baboon to France to help out. Its name was Jackie and it had a uniform. Number 41. Dead fish. Goldfish were also employed, or we should say sacrificed. They were used to test the water that had been used to wash gas masks. If the fish died, those masks needed a better washing. Number 40. A stairway to hell. The Brits used to hate German Zeppelins, which are kind of rigid airships that would fly over Britain. They killed about 500 people in the UK, and the British public certainly didn't like the sight of them. The first ever Zeppelin attack by Germany on Britain happened at Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn in January 1915. By the end of the war, the Brits had become pretty good at shooting them down, destroying 77 of the 115 airships of the German Zeppelin fleet. Number 39. British men. When the war began, there were just 350,000 soldiers in the British Army. That number became millions when conscription was introduced in 1916. That meant that if you were a bloke aged 18 to 41 and in decent health, off to war you went. Number 38. I'm not going. Some people just refused to fight. Many of those people may have had an inkling of the utter carnage that was taking place on the front lines while higher-ups were busy moving plastic figures over a map. Others were pacifists because of their religious beliefs. Those that refused to go were called conscientious objectors, and it's believed there were 16,000 of them in the UK. One man writes, I looked him straight in the eye and told him, I said, I respectfully refuse to obey your orders. And he went barmy. Absolutely barmy. Barmy means crazy, if you didn't know already. Not many Brits use this word nowadays. Number 37. Dear Bertrand. British philosopher Bertrand Russell was a conscientious objector. I never believed so frightful a thing could happen. It is utter madness for us to join this war, said Russell. This very intelligent man was well aware of what scheming is often behind wars and the propaganda countries use to send their men to die. Russell said the public needed to think harder about war, stating, the force that in the long run makes for peace and all other things is reason, the power of thinking against instinct. He wasn't keen on American war policies either later in his life. He died at the ripe old age of 97. Number 36. It was the Germans who first used the flamethrower in the war, and their scary machines could fire flames 130 feet. Historians wrote that the Flammenwerfer terrified British soldiers. Number 35. Tank sex. The British had male and female tanks in the war. Male tanks had 2 6-pounder guns and 3 303 Hotchkiss machine guns, while female tanks had 1 Hotchkiss and 4 Vickers machine guns. Number 34, Mexico Go. The Brits intercepted a German telegraph in 1917. It was a message from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Germany's minister in Mexico. It said, "Please invade the USA." The Brits didn't tell the USA about the message at first. They waited for a better time instead. The Brits thought if America was going to get involved, there had to be a perfect moment to show the country that it was almost invaded. Number 33, PTSD. Imagine what it would be like seeing half your friends being killed. This kind of warfare is unimaginable to people today. Many soldiers returned home and became what people have called a quiet man. In the army, there wasn't much sympathy, and if men suffered psychologically, they were often called weak. Number 32, how do you really feel? We found this excerpt from a book written after the war about the mental state of some men that came back. It says that some of those men suffered loss of memory, insomnia, terrifying dreams, pains, emotional instability, diminution of self-confidence and self-control, attacks of unconsciousness or of changed consciousness, sometimes accompanied by convulsive movements resembling those characteristic of epileptic fits, incapacity to understand any but the simplest matters, obsessive thoughts, usually of the gloomiest and most painful kind, even, in some cases, hallucinations and incipient delusions. It also states that these symptoms make life for some of their victims a veritable hell. Number 31, no shocks please. Sigmund Freud didn't like the fact that many of these suffering men were given electric shock therapy, which basically meant destroying their brains. Freud wrote that war neuroses were best treated with psychoanalysis, not shocks. Number 30, military men don't get neuroses. The military fought back against all these intellectuals, saying war could ruin a man physically and psychologically. One military man wrote, "War neuroses, which persists, is not a credible disease to have, as it indicates in practically every case a lack of the soldierly qualities which have distinguished the Allied armies. No one should be permitted to glorify himself as a case of shell shock." Shell shock was exactly what it sounds like, a kind of PTSD before the expression was created. Number 29, 6th place. It's generally thought that the First World War was the 6th deadliest of modern wars. Number 28, Chinese warriors. Maybe the deadliest war of all time was the Three Kingdoms War in China that lasted 60 years from 220 to 280. It's thought as many as 40 million people died. The Mongol invasions killed almost that number. Number 27, letters to the front. 12 million letters were delivered to the Western Front every week. It took them 2 days to get there from the UK. Number 26, plastic faces. It was this war that more or less started the work of plastic surgeons, as so many people lost bits of their faces and other body parts. One soldier described what happened to his face in the war. "I could feel something lying loosely in my left cheek, as though I had a chicken bone in my mouth. It was, in reality, half my jaw, which had been broken off, teeth and all, and was floating about in my mouth." Number 25, banks of blood. The first ever blood bank was set up in 1917 on the Western Front. Number 24, the mess of Gallipoli. 58,000 soldiers died at the bloody Battle of Gallipoli, a move thought up by Winston Churchill to bring down Germany's ally, Ottoman Turkey. Australia's ex-prime minister once said this battle left horrific scars and was, in a critical sense, our nation's baptism of fire, and 8,000 Australians didn't come back. 87,000 Ottoman Turkish troops also died. Number 23, Old Siam. It's said one of the countries hardly anyone knew joined the war was Thailand. 19 Thai soldiers died of accident and disease, although in those days they were called Siamese, as the country was called Siam. The soldiers fought on the side of the Allies. Number 22, poetry, not pain relief. People wear poppies to commemorate war because of a poem written about World War I. That poem is called In Flanders Fields. This is one stanza. "We are the dead, short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields." Number 21, no food. The British had such a big food shortage that the government banned feeding pigeons and people throwing rice at weddings. Number 20, fake Paris. During the war, the French built a fake Paris to fool German bombers. The Telegraph writes, a second Paris, complete with a Champs-Élysées and Gare du Nord, was built towards the end of the First World War to fool German bombers. The fake city was very much a secret and it was never fully finished or tested. Number 19, we speak no English here, dude. Did you know that before World War I, German was the second most widely spoken language in the USA, but was forcibly suppressed because of the war? Number 18, Germans were treated badly in America. During the war, all Germans in America were forced to carry registration cards at all times after they had registered at the post office. NPR writes that the US wanted to get rid of all things German, saying, during World War I, US government propaganda erased German culture. The Huffington Post also states that 2,048 Germans living in America were arrested and forced to live in internment camps. Number 17, ban on sausages. During the war, Germany put a ban on eating sausages. 250,000 cow intestines were used to make just one Zeppelin, so intestines were in demand. Number 16, fake news. The British wanted America to get involved in the war, so it decided one way to do that was to write some fake news to get Americans emotional and harbor some anti-German sentiments. They had journalist John R. Ratham write reports that were later said to be fraudulent. According to Time magazine, his motto was raise hell and sell papers. Other media reports that his false reports stirred up anger against many innocent Germans living in the US. Number 15, Native Americans. It's said about 13,000 Native Americans fought in the war. Number 14, the native tongue. Germans were always breaking codes, and it was hard to come up with something to beat that. After hearing two native Choctaw soldiers talking, one American officer realized that the Germans would never understand this strange language. The BBC writes, the Choctaw Telephone Squad was born. It said this band of men were instrumental in winning many battles. Number 13, clever birds. It's thought that about 500,000 pigeons carried messages during the war. Some of them were sent to the front line by parachute. One such message we found read, on water attacked by 3 Huns. Huns were Germans. Don't ever call pigeons pests again. Number 12, the return of the hawks. The Germans didn't much like how the British used those clever birds, so the German army trained hawks to kill the pigeons. Number 11, the Sorry Somme. The worst battle in British history was at the Battle of the Somme. Some 60,000 British men died in just one day. It's said more than 1 million British, French, and German troops were killed or injured. 465,000 to 600,000 were German, 350,000 were British, and 204,000 were French. Soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, South Africa, and Canada also died. One German officer once wrote, Somme, the whole history of the world cannot contain a ghastlier word. Number 10, genocide. It's said that during the war, the Turks slaughtered around 1.5 million Armenians. Robbery and rape were also common. This is known as the Armenian Holocaust. Number 9, Silent Night. Time magazine writes, on a crisp, clear morning 100 years ago, thousands of British, Belgian, and French soldiers put down their rifles, stepped out of their trenches, and spent Christmas mingling with their German enemies along the Western Front. Stories differ, but it's generally thought about 100,000 soldiers had a truce on Christmas Day, singing hymns, and even playing football in no man's land. One British soldier wrote, first the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours. Number 8, new nations. After the war, independent nations emerged. They were Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Number 7, big guns. In 1917, the Germans pulled out what was at the time the biggest gun in the world. It looked more like a house than a gun, and it could fire shells up to 31 miles. Its name was Lang Max, which meant Long Max. Number 6, rape of Belgium. The Germans marched into Belgium and all hell broke loose. They killed and plundered, but it wasn't as bad as how the British media portrayed the invasion. The Brits compared German soldiers to serial killer Jack the Ripper. Nonetheless, things were pretty bad. 18,296 children became war orphans. So yes, it was bad, but not as bad as the Brits made it out. Fake news isn't new by any means. Number 5, mud bath. Some sources say that the mud at times was so thick that some soldiers disappeared in it. By the way, trenches were given names such as Death Valley. In all, 25,000 miles of trenches were dug. Number 4, famous soldiers. Who fought in the war? The Lord of the Rings author J.R.R. Tolkien was one famous person. Harry S. Truman was also there, and so was Mr. Adolf Hitler. Walt Disney tried to sign up, but was rejected because of his young age. He did, however, end up driving ambulances in France. Number 3, lots of love, your dearest son. War was horrible, and letters home to families can be harrowing to read. One man wrote, "Just a line to let you know that I got the fags, or cigarettes, on Tuesday. I thank you very much for sending them. They have stopped the weekend passes as there are a lot of absences, but I shall ask the captain for permission to come on a pass. We are going to the front on the 19th of November. Dear mother, do not worry about me, for by God's help I shall come home well." He died soon after he wrote that letter, according to the Telegraph. Here's another letter. This is what they call the Somme. Up to the neck in mud and water, shells flying everywhere. That was from a Brit called Grimshaw. We are not sure what happened to him. Number 2, British seamen write the best letters. Because of the Freedom of Information Act, we know that a man called Mansfield Smith Cumming did something original when he served in the Secret Service during the war. Apparently, he discovered that semen, or sperm, made great invisible ink, and like other invisible inks, it was impossible to find with chemicals. Mr. Cumming wrote, "Now every man has his own stylo." Okay, we know this sounds a bit like fake news, but Britain's Telegraph backs the story up, stating, "British intelligence services experimented with using semen as an invisible ink to write top secret letters. Now you know how to send secret letters to your lover. Use your man juice." Number 1, no condoms for Americans. It seems the USA was the only country not to give its soldiers condoms for their time served during the war. It's also said that thousands of American soldiers returned home with STDs. The Huffington Post writes an estimated 400,000 military men were infected with syphilis or gonorrhea. Those Yank soldiers were very popular in those days with European girls. Apparently, the British also didn't give condoms to its forces at the start, but changed that policy quite quickly. Perhaps with all that terrible destruction going on, one solace to soldiers was wanting to create a new life. Okay, so before we start this Cold War epic, we should probably explain to you what the Cold War was. The Americans and Soviets were more or less buddies during the Second World War, fighting together against the Axis powers. But the US was very concerned about communism and the despotic Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. To put it bluntly, America feared that the commies, as it liked to say, would take over the world. For that reason, the US wanted to contain communist expansionism. But the Soviets were building an arsenal of arms, including nuclear weapons. Thus, an arms race was on the way. It's thought Bernard Mans Baruch, an American financier and multimillionaire, coined the term Cold War, which basically means a war without military action. And so, without further ado, welcome to this episode of the Infographics Show, 50 Facts About the Cold War You Didn't Know. Fact number 50. So, as we said, it was Bernard Mans that coined the term Cold War. He was a rich man and also an advisor to all US presidents from Woodrow Wilson to Harry S. Truman. He's famous for saying this, "Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a Cold War. Our enemies are to be found abroad and at home. Let us never forget this. Our unrest is the heart of their success." Number 49. It was Winston Churchill who first used the term Iron Curtain in relation to the Cold War, which basically means the metaphorical divide between the Soviet bloc and the West. Number 48. Churchill is often said to be one of the most mythologized leaders that ever existed. He may have been a great orator during times of conflict, but he has also been accused of being a bigot, a snob, a racist, and being not too sympathetic to those who suffered at the hands of the British Empire. Perhaps one of the reasons why he was good at talking was because he was a big fan of amphetamines. Number 47. Over on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Joseph Stalin was responsible for around 2.9 million deaths. Those deaths, historians say, were related to Stalin's oppression, the Gulag, and forced resettlement. But if we include total deaths due to poverty and famine while Stalin was in power, the number could be as high as 60 million. As far as evil dictators go, Stalin is often said to take the number 2 spot behind China's prolific, paranoid practitioner of violence, Mao Zedong. Surprisingly, Hitler only gets the bronze for evilness. Number 46. Stalin wasn't really named Stalin. He was born Joseph Vissarionovich Jugashvili, but that doesn't really have a cool ring to it. He changed his name to Stalin because it means Man of Steel. Superman's currently rolling over in his grave. Number 45. The Cold War started under American President Harry Truman and ended while George Bush Sr. was in power. If you were around in 1989, you might have read the headline, "Bush and Gorbachev suggest the Cold War is coming to an end." Number 44. The Soviets drew amazingly detailed maps of the whole world during the Cold War. In fact, the US and the UK were astounded by how detailed and accurate they were, so much so that the US State Department uses them today. Wired wrote in 2015, university libraries at places like Stanford, Oxford, and the University of Texas in Austin have drawers stuffed with Cold War Soviet maps. Number 43. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed off on a resolution that made "In God We Trust" the official American motto. Some people didn't like this, given America's religious diversity, but the president saw it as an important move against communist materialism. He also made it a law that the motto should appear on all American coins and bills, presumably to make sure the American public would never forget who they trusted the most. Number 42. "Under God" was added to the American Pledge of Allegiance for pretty much the exact same reason. Number 41. Even though the Soviets and the USA were involved in what was called the space race, at one point they were thinking about teaming up during the Cold War. According to NASA's website, Eisenhower suggested creating a process to secure space for peaceful uses. Khrushchev, however, rejected the offer. Number 40. Chinese Communist Party leader Mao Zedong had been treated badly by the Soviets on many occasions. He got his own back though when he met Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Mao loved swimming, and he had learned that Khrushchev couldn't swim. On one visit, the latter was met by Mao, who offered him some bathing shorts. He took Khrushchev to a private swimming pool. According to the Smithsonian, Khrushchev, meanwhile, stood uncomfortably in the children's end of the pool until Mao, with more than a touch of malice, suggested that he join him in the deeper water. The embarrassed Soviet leader needed a flotation device and apparently paddled like a dog. Mao was a happy man. Some years later, Khrushchev said it was Mao's way of putting himself in an advantageous position. Number 39. When Mao visited Moscow in 1949, Stalin pretty much left him in a hotel and kept feeding him lots of food. Little did Mao know that Soviet scientists were secretly collecting his poop so that they could analyze it and see what he was made of. Number 38. When Mao was 69, he had a 14-year-old girlfriend. Number 37. According to the BBC in 2017, for decades, the BBC hired MI5 to vet anyone who worked for it. If they were even slightly too left-leaning, they would soon be made unemployed. The BBC writes that by hiring what they called subversives, it might lead to a left-leaning government. You must remember that many American and European intellectuals might not have been keen on Soviet rule, but many were so-called Marxists. 36. In the USA, Joe McCarthy created vast paranoia regarding Reds under the bed and communist infiltration of good old American society. McCarthy was feared, and his stringent witch hunts pervaded all areas of society. He didn't seem to have any scruples either, but that may have been due to the heroin that he was addicted to. It's said that America's first war on drugs czar, Harry Anslinger, made sure McCarthy got his fix. Number 35. It's said one of the most successful spying operations from the UK and the US was something called Operation Tamarisk. This involved rooting through Soviet trash to find documents. The thing was though, sometimes the Soviets ran out of toilet paper and had to wipe themselves with said documents. According to one writer, Tamarisk was British jargon for sifting through the detritus of military exercises. Number 34. MI5 was almost as bad as McCarthy, believing anyone with slight communist links was a threat to British security. They monitored and spied on left-leaning politicians, anti-nuclear weapons groups, anti-apartheid groups, members of Amnesty International, and civil liberties organizations. Number 33. The US planned to detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon in the 1950s. It was known as Project A119, and Carl Sagan was on the team. He was hired to study what the effect would be if you detonated such a bomb in a low-gravity vacuum. It was thought that such a thing would boost American morale and demoralize the Soviets. Number 32. The Soviets wanted to do the same thing. Their plan was codenamed E4. Apparently the E project had certain steps. 1 was to get a spacecraft to the moon, 2 and 3 were to orbit around it, and 4 was to bomb it. What a world we live in, eh? Number 31. The CIA used LSD on its own soldiers as mind control experiments. They did the same to biochemist Frank Olson, who 9 days later mysteriously jumped to his death from a 13-story New York City hotel. Number 30. In 1951, there was a mass poisoning in a French town called Pont Saint-Esprit. People died, but others suffered from scary hallucinations and ended up in the madhouse. It was said to be something in the bread. There are many theories about what happened, and one is that the CIA spiked the bread with massive amounts of LSD as part of its McNaomi chemical warfare program. Writing about the incident of what became known as the cursed bread, the Telegraph newspaper said, one man tried to drown himself, screaming that his belly was being eaten by snakes. An 11-year-old tried to strangle his grandmother. Another man shouted, "I am a plane," before jumping out of a second-floor window, breaking his legs. CIA 1, France 0. Number 29. The United States Air Force in the 50s used drugged bears to test ejector seats in powerful planes. Apparently, Himalayan and American black bears were a good size. No bears died, but some broke bones. You can actually watch it on YouTube. Number 28. And Canada was just as bad. It forced some of its Inuit population to relocate further north just so it could show the Soviets it had sovereignty there. Number 27. It's actually sometimes said that the Cold War started in Canada. That's because a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Sergeyevich Guzenko defected there just after World War II and handed over 109 documents relating to Soviet espionage and future plans. Some of those plans, of course, were to build massive bombs. Number 26. According to the BBC, during the Cold War, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and US President John F. Kennedy wrote each other lots of letters. They even sent each other gifts. One such gift was given to Kennedy's daughter. It was a dog called Pushinka, who was the offspring of one of the Soviet space dogs. It, in turn, had puppies, which JFK called the Pupniks. Number 25. If you check out recently released secret files from the National Archive, there's a conversation with the CIA director in 1975 and an attorney. The attorney asks, is there any information involved with the assassination of President Kennedy which in any way shows that Lee Harvey Oswald was in some way a CIA agent? But mysteriously, that's where the document ends. Number 24. The term Third World was not related to poverty or standards of living when it was first used, but it meant any countries not in NATO. Number 23. The British satirical puppet show Spitting Image showed Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev with what looked like a hammer and sickle painted on his forehead. It's actually a port wine stain, a discoloration of the skin. Number 22. If you look at secret files, you can see what Gorbachev thought about 3,000 Chinese being killed at Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1989. In a meeting, he discussed what would happen if his own government met with resistance. We must be realists. They have to defend themselves, and so do we. 3,000 people? So what? He said. Number 21. Later in life, Gorbachev teamed up with former US President Bill Clinton to make a children's music CD. They won a Grammy for their efforts. Number 20. During the Cold War, the Americans devised a cunning plan. They would portray President Nixon as crazy. So crazy, he might press that red button at any time and start a nuclear war. They called this the madman theory. The theory was that if they could make someone look so volatile, then other countries wouldn't provoke the US. Some media now say Donald Trump uses the madman theory, or at least it looks like that. Number 19. The USA spent $20 million on a cat. We should probably just leave you to think about that, but we won't. Called the Acoustic Kitty, this cat was designed to spy on Soviets, as it had a listening device implanted in its ear canal. On its first mission to spy on two gents in a Soviet compound in the US, it got hit by a taxi and died. Some people refute this and say the cat was just useless. Either way, it's amusing if you don't pay taxes in the US. Declassified documents show how the CIA resigned themselves to failure, stating that spying cats were just not practical. Number 18. The CIA didn't stop at felines. They also trained ravens, pigeons, and goats. In fact, as was revealed years later, animal training for spying purposes was a huge project at Langley. Number 17. In 2017, the New York Times wrote a story about a man who had just died at 77. His name was Stanislav Petrov, and it was a decision he made that saved us from an all-out nuclear war. In 1983, his missile early warning system informed him that the US had launched 5 Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles at Russia. Protocol was an immediate retaliatory strike, but the man just couldn't believe it was real. And it wasn't. The machine was malfunctioning. 23 minutes later, I realized that nothing had happened. If there had been a real strike, then I would already know about it. It was such a relief, he told the press. Number 16. This is the first line of an article in The Guardian. If you were born before October 27, 1962, Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov saved your life. At the height of the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets were about to strike with nuclear weapons. They believed America was about to strike a submarine with a nuclear weapon, and so the giant USS Randolph became the target for a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo. You need 3 high-ranking officers to launch, and Arkhipov said no. It turned out the US wasn't thinking about its own launch. Phew. Number 15. LA Times headline, July 25, 1986. US and Soviets may stage joint Mars mission. Apparently, Reagan changed his mind, which must have been a bummer for the then-child Elon Musk. Number 14. In 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was on its way from New York to Seoul. It didn't get there because the Soviets shot it down, killing all 269 passengers and crew. It was thought to have been a spy plane, but it was just a regular old 747 carrying mostly vacation goers. This created a lot of anti-Soviet sentiment around the world. Number 13. The reason we first got the Global Positioning System, or GPS, was because of that plane getting hit. After the event, President Reagan made sure that GPS became a technology available to anyone in the world. Prior to that, only the military had it. Number 12. In the 60s in the USA, planes would fly around all the time carrying nuclear bombs. This was a just-in-case scenario. 5 of these planes with the bombs on board crashed. That included a B-52 that crashed in North Carolina in 1961, and it was carrying 2 3-4 megaton Mark 39 nuclear bombs. 2 people died, but you won't have heard about it. This was classified information. And little did North Carolina residents know that the bombs almost detonated. Do you think they would have blamed Russia? Number 11. As is often the case, the Russian threat was overblown. While it was reported that Russia had scores of intercontinental ballistic missiles in the 50s and 60s, it was later revealed they only had 4. Number 10. If you look at the CIA Field Agent Training Manual from the 50s, you'll find the secret CIA shoelace code. This showed you how you could tie your laces in certain ways to tell someone something. It might mean, I have some information, or keep following me. Number 9. In 1959, Soviet Premier Khrushchev wanted to take his family to visit Disneyland when he was visiting the US. He found out he was barred. The State Department was later apologetic, saying he could take his family another day to see Mickey Mouse and Company. The US said the reason for the snub was only because of safety reasons. Soviet leaders weren't exactly popular in the States in those days. Putin didn't go either, he just made his own version of Disneyland in Russia. Number 8. If your job is related to the destruction of the world and you know how tenuous our safety is, you might as well have some bad habits, eh? Well, check out the 1960s semi-automatic ground environment computer for the Department of Defense. It's got built-in ashtrays. Number 7. But health of citizens wasn't a big concern of the USA in those days. Indeed, during the 50s and 60s, the military secretly used biological weapons on parts of the country to see what would happen. People got sick in San Francisco, but it was worse elsewhere, especially if you were poor. A sociologist named Lisa Martino Taylor said St. Louis was particularly used for these experiments, and the reason was because there were plenty of poor black neighborhoods you could spray with radioactive particles. Life Science says no one would have died because of the experiments, but people were definitely exposed to toxic particles. The Army exposed St. Louis residents to a maximum of 14.4 cigarettes worth of cadmium over 31 months, said the website. Number 6. During the Cold War, US Air Force pilots were given eye patches. They were told that a nuclear explosion would blind them and make flying impossible. So if they got the DEFCON 2, or Defense Readiness Condition 2 alert, which means next step to nuclear war, armed forces ready to deploy and engage in fewer than 6 hours, they should put on the patch and save one eye. Number 5. The military had programs in the 50s and 60s whereby they would tattoo children with their blood group. It seems the programs were only in Indiana and Utah. These kids then became walking blood banks, which is handy if everyone around you is dying. I still have my atomic tattoo, O negative, but as I grew it got distorted, so it's pretty illegible today, said one person, now an adult. Number 4. Back to animals and a bright idea from the Brits, MI5 didn't need exceptionally expensive cats, what they used were the entirely expendable rodents called gerbils. MI5 sleuths planned to use gerbils to trap secret agents, terrorists, and subversives during the Cold War, writes The Guardian. The plan was simple. Gerbils can smell sweat easily. Bad people at airports sweat and release an adrenaline scent. So gerbils were left at airport counters. These crafty creatures had been trained to push a lever if they smelled someone releasing lots of adrenaline scent. And yes, this is real. Number 3. In 1962, the US detonated a hydrogen bomb in space, creating what it called a spectacular light show. Why did the US do this? Just to see what would happen, of course. The test was given a cool name, Starfish Prime. Number 2. When the Brits weren't training gerbils to work at airports, they were busy lying about H-bombs. In the 90s, the US Department of Energy released archives from 1958. In those archives were documents pertaining to the British bluffing about an H-bomb test in the 1950s. H-bombs are known as fusion bombs, while atomic bombs are fission bombs. The former is much more powerful. The Brits wanted to be seen as a superpower that shouldn't be messed with, so they faked the whole thing, in that they blew up an A-bomb and said it was an H-bomb. And finally, number 1. We are going to end on something funny. The story goes that a man named Frank Wisner, who was managing psychological warfare for the US, planned to drop thousands of condoms over the Soviet army from the air. The condoms would be labeled medium, and this was supposed to demoralize Soviet troops as they contemplated their well-endowed American foes. Wisner was said to have had a great sense of humor, but that didn't stop him from killing himself in 1965.
The archives are open. In its history of over 100 years, the FBI has classified many documents, until now. Now these government secrets are open for anyone to see. Here are 50 of the most insane declassified secrets of the FBI, including details on one of America's most mysterious residents. Number 50. Alive or dead? In the aftermath of World War II, the entire world celebrated the death of the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. But despite the confirmation that his life had ended in a Berlin bunker as the Allied troops marched in, rumors started to spread. Did Hitler actually escape like so many of his Nazi allies, maybe to South America? Did he shave his mustache and go undercover as an everyday suburban man, as one ill-advised sitcom imagined? The rumors persisted enough that in the months after the war, the FBI investigated evidence of his survival, and the declassified documents showed, nope, he's dead. It wasn't the only FBI investigation related to the war. Number 49. The wife. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant physicist heavily responsible for the United States winning the race to the atom bomb, was largely trusted by the US government, despite some past leftist ties. But he was also married, and the FBI had some doubts about her. A trained biologist, she worked for the government at Los Alamos to help determine the body's vulnerability to radiation. The FBI was more concerned with her early life when she'd been involved with communist activist Joseph Leyte Jr. and joined the Communist Party. This led to her being investigated by agents about her current ties and to her husband's clearance being reduced. But many FBI investigations during the era were much more wide-reaching. Number 48. Detention. Even before President Roosevelt's infamous executive order that led to the imprisonment of the United States Japanese-American population, the government was hard at work arresting people. During the war, anyone deemed a security threat could be rounded up and detained by the government during the national state of emergency, and it centered on three groups: Japanese Americans, German Americans, and Italian Americans. All were arrested with little room for appeal, and the FBI kept an exhaustive list of the numbers. But being investigated by the FBI isn't always a negative. Number 47. The Money Man. It's rare for someone to play a key role in the home front for two world wars, but Bernard Baruch wasn't an ordinary man. The stock market magnate was chairman of the War Industries Board under Woodrow Wilson and advised President Roosevelt on industry and production decades later. When anyone is that close to the president, the FBI will want to take a look at him. Did they find any red flags on the man? Given that he was later appointed to the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission by Harry Truman, it's likely a no. And in some cases, it's all about confirming what's already known. Number 46. Operation Paperclip. When the US government decided to recruit former Nazis to help with the nuclear and space programs after the war, they knew they would need thorough background checks. After all, they were okay with some Nazis, but not the worst of the worst. The FBI was tasked into digging into wartime activities of these scientists and deciding if they were valuable and relatively clean enough to become Americans. Now, on the FBI's websites, Americans can dig into the original reports of figures like Arthur Randolph and Werner von Braun. But sometimes the FBI was looking to prevent war before it happened. Number 45. Flying solo. While the US never went to war with the Soviet Union, paranoia was high about the communist nation infiltrating and sabotaging the Americans. That's why the FBI created Solo, an intelligence effort that spanned 2 decades. It's placed agents within the Communist Party of the United States to discover if they were passing information to communist nations like the Soviet Union or China. The operation was largely headed by 2 agents, now declassified as Russian Jewish immigrants Morris and Jack Childs, whose background gave them the skills needed to infiltrate Russian communist enclaves. But not every espionage investigation is above board. Number 44. In the bag. How do you get a search warrant when the subject of the investigation is classified? Simple, you don't. During the 1940s and beyond, the FBI frequently pulled off what was called black bag operations. This was when the organization would simply break into residences or businesses under the cover of darkness and search for evidence, without ever informing the subject of the search that they were being watched. Many of these never escalated to criminal prosecution, so they weren't disclosed until the files were declassified. The tactic continued until 1966 when the Bureau ordered it stopped and it was declared unconstitutional in 1972. But not all targets of FBI investigation are as obvious. Number 43. The Lady of Peace. Jane Addams was one of the most prominent early feminist reformers, a tireless advocate in the progressive era for women's suffrage and public housing. She even became the first American woman to be awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize for her role in the anti-war and anti-imperialist movement. So, why is there an FBI file on the woman? How about a treason investigation? When World War I began, Addams held fast to her anti-war beliefs and she founded a women's party devoted to peace. In the 1920s, when she opposed the persecution of communist activists, the FBI started monitoring her, but came up empty on criminal charges. But one peace movement led to more investigations than any other. Number 42. Yippee? The Vietnam War was deeply controversial, and many anti-war activists wound up being investigated by the government. Chief among them was Abbie Hoffman, whose brushes with the law would lead to what became known as the Trial of the Chicago Eight. His group, the Youth International Party, better known as the Yippies, was frequently investigated by the FBI over a period of 5 years. Those digging through the FBI archives will find a whopping 50-part series on the colorful figure who wound up being portrayed by Sacha Baron Cohen in the movie The Trial of the Chicago Seven. One bloody day would come to define the Vietnam protest movement and lead to years of FBI investigation. Number 41. Blood on American soil. It started out as any other peace rally in 1970, with students at Kent State University in Ohio protesting the National Guard presence on campus as the war expanded to Cambodia. But what wasn't typical was the National Guard opening fire on the unarmed crowd, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. 2 of the dead were bystanders, not protesters, and massive rallies around the country protested the killings. Ultimately, none of the guardsmen who fired were criminally prosecuted. But the FBI spent years investigating the shooting, and all those documents can now be read in a 22-part series. But some FBI cases are a lot less serious. Number 40. There's no place like home? Few pieces of movie memorabilia are more iconic. Dorothy's iconic ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz. That's why it was such big news when they were stolen from the Judy Garland Museum in 2005. The theft was reported to the police, but the interstate smuggling operation was soon taken over by the FBI. It took the government organization more than 10 years to track down the thief, and even then it took multiple agents on a sting operation before the rare shoes were returned back home where they belonged. But some cases might be a little silly. Number 39. Sing that song. Louie Louie. Oh no. Me gotta go. The song's probably stuck in your head now, right? Or not. But what does it actually mean? No one really knows, and neither did the FBI. When the popular song by the Kingsmen debuted in 1963, it became a sensation, and many people wondered if the song was hiding a dirty little secret. Were the words secretly pornographic? Were they hiding a coded political message? The FBI spent a full year investigating the song and its creators and came up empty, as the lyrics remain as unintelligible as they were back in 1963. It wasn't the only time the FBI got involved in music. Number 38. Not Fab. Everyone loved the Beatles, if their army of screaming fans was any indication. But the government wasn't as fond of the shaggy-haired British band, and the Nixon administration had a particular grudge against left-wing songwriter John Lennon. Nixon was convinced that Lennon was plotting to influence the 1972 election with his popularity, and the FBI launched an investigation that led to the Immigration and Naturalization Service starting the process of deporting Lennon. While Lennon was never banned from the country, he did back off plans for an American tour, a victory for Nixon that was later exposed by journalist John Wiener. But you might be shocked by just how many celebrities have FBI files. Number 37. Before the White House. Ronald Reagan having an FBI file shouldn't be a surprise. After all, they probably like to know about the president. But he was on the agency's radar long before 1980. In 1947, when he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, he had a file. But why would they want to know about the staunch conservative, surely the last suspect anyone would have as a communist agent? Because Reagan was such a strong anti-communist that he and his then-wife Jane Wyman worked with federal agents to turn over the name of any actors they thought might be communists. The future president was an informant. But one more beloved figure had FBI ties as well. Number 36. The Mouse's Secret. Walt Disney was notorious for being a traditionalist, and the man behind Mickey Mouse and the Disney parks didn't like anything that shattered the illusion of the all-American happiness in his properties. That included people with unpopular political views, which led to his deep ties with the government. He had worked with them on World War II propaganda films, and long after the war, he was still cooperating with them, giving them information on un-American activities in Hollywood. He continued working with them through his death in 1966, and was even named a full special agent in charge contact. But many celebrities have files for less official reasons. Number 35. The Lady Sings. Why would Whitney Houston have an FBI file? The late singer lived a controversial life, and it got her on the government's radar. While her troubles with drugs and money and her often chaotic relationships landed her in the tabloids, the FBI was more interested in her associates. Many people from her life tried to take advantage of her, including a stalker who tried to blackmail her for $250,000. But why would one of the least controversial singers of all times be on the list? Number 34. Take Me Home? John Denver seemed like the guy next door, with his easy-listening country music songs being the type your parents sing along to on a long car ride. But the FBI saw things differently. Up until his death in a plane crash, Denver had amassed a 33-page FBI file. It was mostly concerned with his anti-war activism as a young man and his occasional drug use, but it also followed stalkers and death threats he picked up as a celebrity. The FBI even got involved in some notorious tabloid stories. Number 33. The Bombshell. Anna Nicole Smith was famous for marrying a much older man who died not long after. She inherited most of the fortune, much to the anger of the oil tycoon's son, E. Pierce Marshall. The two were involved in a vicious court battle over the massive bank account, vicious enough for Marshall to believe Smith tried to kill him. This led to an FBI investigation that ultimately decided there wasn't enough to charge Smith. Ultimately, it was all for nothing. Marshall and Smith died within a year of each other in 2006 and 2007. But even the original bombshell was on the FBI's radar. Number 32. Government prefers blondes? Marilyn Monroe has been the subject of countless government conspiracies due to her mysterious death. But the FBI wasn't interested in that. They were more concerned with her love life. One of Monroe's many loves was acclaimed playwright Arthur Miller, who was believed to have communist leanings. Due to Monroe's influence, the FBI kept an eye on her, which led many to believe the government might have been involved in her death. But she wasn't the only icon to wind up in the FBI's files. Number 31. Lucy! Everyone loved Lucille Ball, who along with husband Desi Arnaz created one of the most iconic sitcoms of all time. But Ball was an eccentric woman who once claimed she picked up spy chatter in her tooth fillings. The FBI was more concerned with her political leanings, as the comedy star had been affiliated with the Communist Party in the 1930s. Ball was repeatedly interviewed and denied having any ongoing communist affiliations. While she was never placed on the notorious blacklists of the 50s, her file grew to 156 pages. But some stars had a rougher road with the FBI. Number 30. Hardly Silent. Charlie Chaplin was best known for the physical comedy and for famously opposing Hitler with his silent film The Great Dictator. But he was anything but silent off the screen. He was a political activist who was believed to be a communist sympathizer. Chaplin was a British citizen who worked a lot in the United States, and J. Edgar Hoover wanted to make that more difficult. He even famously blocked Chaplin's return to the US in 1952, which led Chaplin and his wife to depart for Switzerland permanently. This next target wasn't afraid to fight back. Number 29. Turnabout is fair play. Truman Capote likely expected to be investigated by the FBI. After all, the author behind Breakfast at Tiffany's was a well-known left-wing activist who supported Fidel Castro in Cuba and exposed the injustices of the U.S. justice system. But why did the colorful author have a 200-page FBI file? That might be because he made a personal enemy of J. Edgar Hoover by spreading rumors that the FBI chief was in a homosexual relationship. Sometimes it's not anything someone does, it's what the FBI thinks they can get. Number 28. Hard Rock. Rock Hudson was one of the first true matinee idols, a handsome movie star who became a sensation in the 60s, but he had a secret, and the FBI was ready to take advantage. Hudson, a closeted gay man, was interviewed by the FBI, and the 34-page FBI file can be accessed online, but not all of it. The file is still heavily redacted, which has led many to wonder what the FBI wanted with Hudson, who famously became one of Hollywood's first AIDS casualties. Sports brought a surprising number of figures to the FBI's attention. Number 27. The Breakthrough. Few figures in American history have become more universally loved than Jackie Robinson, the man who broke Major League Baseball's color barrier. But after his accomplishment, Robinson refused to be quiet and play ball. He became involved in the civil rights movement and supported presidential candidates from both parties. But what got him on the FBI's radar was his support of a Harlem facility for the International Workers' Order, which had supposedly had communist ties. But one sports icon was on the FBI's radar for far less savory reasons. Number 26. Shame of the Yankees. George Steinbrenner was many things, including the owner of the Yankees during one of their most successful periods, but he was also a notorious crook. He made illegal donations to Nixon's re-election campaign, wound up paying a $15,000 fine, and then campaigned to be pardoned of the charges. While he eventually got his wish, his shady financial dealings led him to have an extensive FBI file from 1986 to his death in 2010. Sometimes people get investigated before a big promotion. Number 25. The man for the jobs? Steve Jobs is a big name to anyone who loves their Apple computer or iPad or iPhone, but he was on the government's radar as early as 1991. George H.W. Bush was considering appointing him to the Export Council, and the FBI conducted routine background checks. What they found wasn't routine, and it likely torpedoed his appointment. Not only did they find out that he experimented with LSD as a teenager and spoke positively of the drug, but many people stated that they believed Jobs was a serial liar and a manipulator. But why would the FBI investigate Helen Keller? Number 24. Silent No More. Most people know Helen Keller as the young deaf-blind child who was taught to communicate by vision-impaired schoolteacher Annie Sullivan. But as soon as Keller learned to communicate, she was determined to never be silenced again. She became involved in feminist causes, opposed President Wilson's policies, and even co-founded the American Civil Liberties Union. A proud socialist, she quickly wound up on the government's radar where she has a 45-page FBI file, something she would no doubt be proud of. But many of the FBI's files were about the infamous, not the famous. Number 23. The Big Man. Few names appear in the FBI's archives more than Al Capone, the legendary Prohibition-era gangster. While Capone's most storied opponent was Agent Elliot Ness, Ness never worked for the FBI, but the Bureau was keeping tabs on him anyway. Capone was ultimately tripped up not by his smuggling and mob activities, but because he underpaid the government and was nabbed for tax evasion, something the FBI's 36 files on him no doubt caught. Even Supreme Court justices could be on the Bureau's radar. Number 22. The Good Judge. Thurgood Marshall had a complex life, rising from being a civil rights activist and lawyer to becoming the first black judge on the Supreme Court. But his FBI file doesn't look the same as most activists. As an early member of the NAACP, Marshall knew that he would be spied on. That's why the savvy scholar reached out to J. Edgar Hoover in the 50s and met with the FBI leadership. By providing information to them, he helped protect the organization from accusations of being a communist front. But not all judges had such a stellar reputation. Number 21. The Bad Judge? When Abe Fortas was appointed to the Supreme Court by Lyndon Johnson in 1965, he was already a close ally of the president, maybe too close. He was plagued by rumors of obstruction of justice, and when he was going to be elevated to Chief Justice after only 3 years, the investigation picked up heat. The FBI's files showed that he had been the target of serious threats. Ultimately, his nomination for Chief Justice failed, and Fortas resigned from the court. And some cases are more by public demand. Number 20. Where did she go? When Amelia Earhart disappeared during her attempt to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, it was highly unlikely to be a criminal case. Everyone believed that she had encountered some mechanical or weather trouble and likely crashed, never to be seen again. But that didn't stop the iconic airwoman's 1937 disappearance from being looked into. Countless Americans wrote into the FBI asking for assistance in finding her. And while there was never an investigation, her file mostly consists of those letters. It wasn't the only disaster to get an FBI investigation. Number 19. Up in Smoke. The Hindenburg Zeppelin disaster became one of the most famous air disasters of all time when the massive airship caught fire, killing 35 people. While it's now considered a tragic accident, the FBI initially investigated it for sabotage. Their case focused on one Joseph Spa, a comic acrobat who was one of the first passengers to see signs of trouble and jumped before the ship crashed, suffering only minor injuries. While Spa was seen as an anti-Nazi activist and accused of being a saboteur, the FBI didn't find any evidence of an organized plot. Another, even more famous disaster wound up on the FBI's radar. Number 18. The Challenge. When Space Shuttle Challenger went up in flames, taking all the astronauts with it, the Cold War was still at its peak and the paranoia was running high. Could the Soviet Union have struck a devastating blow against the US space program? The FBI investigated with over 100 pages of reports now declassified, and much like the Hindenburg, didn't come up with any evidence of sabotage or terrorism. Sometimes the FBI gets closer to Hollywood than you might expect. Number 17. Real life. Why would the FBI have files on a noir film from 1951? Because the title was I Was a Communist for the FBI, and it followed the story of a real spy who worked for the FBI in the 1940s. The film was a patriotic thriller that portrayed the Second Red Scare as a justified response to the threat of communism, but the FBI still had to investigate to make sure they were being portrayed well and no classified documents were being leaked. But not every FBI file is serious business. Number 16. Thumbs Up. Why would Gene Siskel, the late film critic best known for sparring with Roger Ebert on which film deserved a thumbs up, be in the FBI's files? Was someone there a really big fan of The Silence of the Lambs, which he memorably panned? Siskel's FBI file is one of the shortest, only one page, and a letter from FBI Director William Sessions congratulating him on winning the Golden Plate Award. Receiving that letter from the FBI was probably terrifying before it was opened. It wasn't the only time the FBI got involved in things that might be considered silly. Number 15. Hollyweird. While Lucille Ball was investigated on her own, it isn't the only time her sitcom showed up in the FBI files. In 1977, the FBI was pulled into an elaborate copyright infringement scheme when they were tipped off by studios that someone was attempting to illegally distribute copies of famous movies and TV shows. In addition to Lucy, these included classics like The Partridge Family and The Twilight Zone. Not exactly high crimes, but the studios thought differently. But not every file the FBI has declassified is a case file. Number 14. So you want to be an FBI agent? If you want to wear the badge, you better start studying. The FBI doesn't just take anyone, and the best information you might get comes from the agency themselves. The legal handbook for special agents was released as part of the FBI archives, containing 137 pages of the procedures they use to track bad guys. Just don't count on it teaching you everything. The version released is almost 20 years old, at the very dawn of the digital era. And you might be surprised by who you find in the FBI's archives. Number 13. My privacy. Digging through the archives, you'll find both famous names and non-famous ones who got on the FBI's radar. They can spy on just about anyone if they have cause, and most of their targets don't get charged and never find out they were investigated. That means they could have files on everyone, even you. If you're feeling paranoid all of a sudden, the good news is you can find out. A Freedom of Information Act request can unseal those things on you if they exist and aren't classified, if you're ready to see their thoughts on your browsing history. But some FBI cases are just bizarre. Look to the skies. Number 12. The first memo. Guy Hoddle was a special agent working at the Washington field office who seemed to be a competent man, which made it all the more surprising when he sent a bizarre memo in March 1950. He claimed to be relaying information from an Air Force investigator about the recovery of 3 flying saucers in New Mexico. Not only did he describe them in detail, but the memo claimed that the 3 bodies of extraterrestrials were recovered. Needless to say, no evidence of this was ever confirmed. But it wouldn't be the only investigation into UFOs by the FBI. Number 11. The Con Man. Silas M. Newton was already a powerful man in the oil industry when he contacted the FBI. He claimed to have a device that could find minerals and oil in the ground and was generally regarded as a charlatan. That didn't stop him from claiming he had seen a flying saucer crash land on his territory in 1950. No evidence of it was ever found, and he later changed his story. The FBI's 6-part file on him covers almost 20 years of con artist tactics, but it hasn't stopped UFO fans from using him as a source. But was the FBI really concealing the truth? Number 10. Not so majestic. It was one of the biggest bombshells in the search for UFOs. A document titled Operation Majestic 12. Sent to 2 different FBI offices, it revealed a conspiracy dating back to the Eisenhower administration to recover and investigate alien spacecraft and conceal it from the public. The 22-page memo would have been the biggest scandal in government history if it was real. An investigation revealed it to be a forgery, and it was uploaded with one additional word: bogus. But some famous UFOs were investigated. Number 9. What happened at Roswell? For over 70 years, the events in Roswell, New Mexico have fascinated the public. And while it's been exaggerated in many ways, there was a real event, and a 1-page FBI memo describes it. People reported a mysterious flying disc shaped like a hexagon and suspended from a balloon. Not exactly the massive alien spacecraft, with many people thinking it resembled an odd weather balloon more than an invasion. One particularly terrifying phenomenon wound up on their radar. Number 8. Those poor cows. In the 1970s, western and prairie states found themselves dealing with a rash of animal mutilations, mainly cattle. The animals often had odd sigils carved into them and seemed like they'd been mauled by some sort of machine. At least that's what the description said. While many possible causes that weren't alien were proposed, including satanic cults, no answer to the disturbing phenomenon was ever found. It was enough to get the organization to actually start a new division. Number 7. Look to the skies. There were enough reports of strange sights in the sky that a new organization was founded, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Starting in the 1950s, it worked with the FBI to share reports of unexplained flying objects and determine possible causes. While the correspondence didn't actually result in any UFOs being discovered, the Bureau continued working with them as well as cooperating with the Air Force on a project titled Project Blue Book. But did the FBI ever crack the code of the country's most notorious location? Number 6. Let's break in! Sure, a bunch of guys on the internet thought that they could break into Area 51 and free ET, but we're no closer to figuring out exactly what's in there. Does the FBI archive help with that? Not really. Area 51 isn't under their jurisdiction, and most people working there might not even know. To get some clues, you'd have to look at their rival agency, the CIA, which did actually mention Area 51 in some documents, with no details, and no hints at what might be inside. But the FBI did investigate some seriously bizarre things. Number 5. Mind readers? Is ESP a real phenomenon? Are there actually people who can read minds and predict things before they happen? The FBI Vault states that ESP is considered a perception of information about events beyond what can be learned from the senses or past knowledge. It's a vague phenomenon, and the investigation didn't make it any clearer. They spent 3 years and likely a lot of money to determine there was no scientific support for ESP. And sometimes the FBI might be its own worst enemy. Number 4. The rivalry. The FBI handles domestic affairs and the CIA handles international affairs. You'd think that that'd make them natural allies, but it doesn't always work out that way. The two agencies can be bitter rivals and hesitant to share information. That often leads to missed opportunities for cooperation, especially in cases where international threats are plotting against the United States homeland, like what happened on 9/11. And what does the FBI say about that fateful day? Number 3. The 9/11 files. Few files were more anticipated for declassification than the first documents on the September 11, 2001 attacks. Particularly, many people were wondering if it would shed light on possible involvement by the Saudi royal family in the attacks, and other conspiracy theorists wondered if they would reveal that the US government was involved. The documents shed some light on intelligence failures but didn't implicate anyone new. Sometimes Hollywood doesn't live up to the hype. Number 2. Declassified. When CBS announced a new documentary series titled The FBI Declassified in 2020, many people wondered how they could get away with it. Were they sharing government secrets? Would the FBI break down the door mid-broadcast? Turned out the answer was no on all accounts. The 6-episode documentary shared profiles on some well-known cases, but didn't declassify anything, which probably accounted for the low ratings. But one case might be more mysterious than any other. Number 1. Getting hairy. There is no American legend that fascinates people more than Bigfoot. Is there really a giant hairy humanoid lurking in the woods? The rumors were enough that the FBI actually investigated the legend in the 70s, combing the woods for evidence of hairs, footprints, and waste material. In 1976, they actually did find long hairs that couldn't be matched to any species. The declassified investigation was declared inconclusive, which was more than enough for true believers to say the truth is out there. It's October 25, 1944, and off the coast of the Philippine island of Leyte, American battleships are trading blows with the remnants of the Japanese fleet. Cruisers and destroyers cut through the waters at high speeds, laying withering barrages against each side's most vulnerable ships. In the air, fighters screen the skies from opposing dive bombers and torpedo planes. Japanese naval aviation has been decimated by a year and a half of fierce combat across the Pacific, and now its surviving pilots are inexperienced raw recruits thrown into the teeth of American aces. For Japan, the battle is dire. If it loses, the Americans and their Australian allies will sever Japan's supply lines and cut off its access to oil it so desperately needs to keep its ships at sea. For the US and Australia, a defeat of the Japanese here means the protracted war will be cut dramatically short, potentially leading to victory in just a few months. Both sides know that the outcome of the war hangs on a knife's edge and are throwing everything they have at each other in what will become the greatest naval battle in history. Between August 1942 and 1944, the Americans have pushed the Japanese steadily back across the Pacific. Their losses in Pearl Harbor have been quickly replaced, the full might of the American economy turning to a wartime footing. In June of 1944, the Americans launched an invasion of the Mariana Islands, with the Japanese counterattacking in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, resulting in a disastrous defeat of the Japanese Imperial Navy, which cost it 600 aircraft and the loss of 3 of their remaining aircraft carriers. This defeat has left Japan with virtually no naval air power and struggling to replace its losses with inexperienced pilots, fresh from a training program which has been slashed in half. America, on the other hand, has started rotating its combat pilots back to the States, where they do short tours as combat instructors, giving new American airmen an unparalleled training advantage compared with their Japanese counterparts. The seizing of the Mariana Islands has penetrated Japan's inner defense ring and made the mainland vulnerable to long-range attack by B-29 Superfortress bombers. America's next move is now carefully being calculated, with Admiral Ernest J. King, supported by members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, advocating for a blockade of Japanese forces in the Philippines and focusing on an attack on Taiwan in order to give the US and Australia control of the sea trade routes between Japan and southern Asia. The plan is solid, and with Japanese forces blockaded in the Philippines, they'll be unable to resupply and eventually, perhaps in a few months, forced to surrender. Any attempts by the Japanese to break out of their besieged forces will end in disaster, and they'll be sailing straight into the teeth of a combined US-Australian naval task force supported by air power from surrounding islands. The seizing of Taiwan will also give the US a second launching off point for air attacks against the Japanese mainland and allow medium-range bombers to join in the strikes. Yet General MacArthur disagrees with this plan, partly because he sees leaving the Philippines in Japanese hands a blow to American prestige, and because it would be a personal affront to the man who claimed in 1942, "I shall return." after his forced retreat. The general also highlights the considerable land-based air power that Japan has amassed in the Philippines, a threat significant enough that it's considered too dangerous to ignore by many high-ranking officers outside of the Joint Chiefs, to include Admiral Chester Nimitz. Eventually, President Roosevelt lends his support to taking back the Philippines, and thus the greatest naval battle in history is set into motion. General MacArthur and his forces would invade the island of Leyte in the central Philippines, with close naval support provided by the 7th Fleet, which was at the time made up of both American and Australian units. The U.S. 3rd Fleet, commanded by Admiral William F. Halsey Jr., would provide long-range cover for the invasion. From the onset, the plan held a critical flaw. No single American officer would be in command of the overall attack, a flaw which, combined with the failures in communication, would result in a crisis and nearly a complete strategic disaster for the U.S. The Japanese, who by pure coincidence also lacked an overall commander, drew up 4 victory plans in response to the obvious pending invasion. The plans, however, all called for Japan to commit almost all of its forces in response to any single attack, falling within the lines of Japanese wartime strategy of seeking the decisive battle, a strategy which had failed them repeatedly throughout the war in the Pacific. Most of the times that the Japanese had overcommitted their forces and attempted to force a decisive battle against the U.S. fleets, the Americans had simply withdrawn. The U.S. could afford to replace its losses and oil supplies, while Japan could not. Hence the Japanese' desperate attempts to force one single decisive battle that would cripple the Americans for good. It's early in the morning on October 12th, and Admiral Halsey has ordered the launching of massive airstrikes against the Formosa and Ryukyu Islands. American dive bombers climb through a sky filled with enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, struggling to deliver their payloads against the Japanese airfields. All around them, American Wildcat fighters scream through the sky, goading what's left of Japan's air power into a fight and protecting their bomber escorts. Japan's naval air power may have been severely diminished, but its land-based forces have long been itching for a fight versus the American aviators that have scored such catastrophic losses against their fleets. From sunup to sundown, waves of fighters and bombers swarm the skies above Japanese airfields. The Japanese try to retaliate by targeting the American carriers, but are intercepted by American fighters. After 4 days of non-stop air battle, the Japanese have lost hundreds of fighters and bombers, and their airfields and support facilities have been taken out of commission. The Americans, meanwhile, have lost only 89 aircraft and suffered 1 light cruiser damaged, with 1 heavy cruiser seriously damaged and in need of repairs. The battle over Formosa has been a stunning American success and has taken Japanese air power out of the equation for the invasion of Leyte. In response to the pending American invasion, Japan orders a force of 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers to set sail from Brunei to the Philippines. Squarely in their path, though, are the American submarines Darter and Dace, which at 0:16 hours on October 23rd make radar contact with the incoming Japanese while they wait on the surface. Facing off against a force of 32 combat ships, the 2 submarines decide to engage anyways, knowing that this fleet could inflict serious damage to the rest of the American forces. The Darter shoots off 3 contact reports to the rest of the U.S. Navy, one of which is intercepted by a radio operator on Yamato, but Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita orders no anti-submarine action, believing an attack on his superior forces to be too suicidal for the Americans to consider. Unbeknownst to the Admiral, that's exactly what the Americans are considering though, and the 2 submarines steam at full speed for several hours to get ahead of the Japanese ships. Submerged and lying in wait, the Japanese sail straight into the planned ambush, still taking no anti-submarine actions to protect themselves. At 0524 hours, Darter fires a rapid-fire salvo of 6 torpedoes, and hydrophone operators aboard the heavy cruiser Atago raise the alarm, but too late. Explosions rack the heavy cruiser as 4 torpedoes score a direct hit. The fleet now scrambles, Admiral Kurita incredulous that a single American submarine would dare to threaten his fleet. 10 minutes later, the Darter lines up for a firing solution on the heavy cruiser Takeo, scoring 2 more hits. The Japanese fleet begins dropping depth charges at random, hydrophone operators unable to pinpoint the American submarine, and at times getting what they believe to be false positives from locations the attacking submarine could not possibly be at. At 0556 hours, Dace breaks its cover and fires a spread of torpedoes that score 4 hits on the heavy cruiser Maya, and the Japanese realize that they're not dealing with 1 sub, but 2. The Otago and Maya have taken catastrophic damage and quickly sink. The Takeo is so damaged that her seaworthiness is in question. After being rescued from the water, Admiral Kurita orders the Takeo to retreat back to Brunei, escorted by 2 destroyers. The rest of the fleet is on high alert, and the American subs are in serious danger of being blown out of the water if they remain. So instead, they break off their attack and follow the Takeo, hoping for a chance to finish her off. 3 of Japan's most formidable ships have been knocked out of the fight, and her sailors rattled by the seeming impunity with which American submarines attack them from out of the deep. On the 24th of October, Admiral Kurita's forces continue toward the Philippines, where it makes contact with the U.S. Third Fleet. Despite being superior in firepower, the Third Fleet is missing 2 of its carrier groups, which had been detached and sent to provision and rearm. As the Darter's contact report comes in, Admiral Halsey recalls one of the groups, but lets the other continue on its resupply mission. This leaves the Americans with only 60% of their air power. To support the incoming Japanese fleet, aircraft based off of Luzon are dispatched against the American carriers. 3 waves of 50 to 60 aircraft scream toward the American carriers, but long-range radar has warned them of the threat. Combat air patrols made up of Hellcats rise up to meet the incoming attack, and the majority are shot down or driven off in fierce fighting. Only a single Japanese aircraft carrying an armor-piercing bomb penetrates the heavy air cover, and at 938 hours, the light carrier USS Princeton is struck. The resulting explosion knocks out her emergency sprinklers and fire spreads throughout the ship. The light cruiser Birmingham pulls up alongside her to assist in the firefighting, when suddenly a massive explosion rocks the Princeton, killing 233 sailors. Alongside her, the Birmingham is so badly damaged that the ship is forced to retire, her crew transferred to another vessel. The Princeton is a total loss, but the Americans have decimated the Japanese aircraft, further clearing the skies of hostile fighters and bombers. An hour and a half after the Japanese launched their attack, the Americans launched their own against the Japanese fleet. The battleships Nagato, Yamato, and Musashi are struck, along with the heavy cruiser Myoko, which is forced to retreat. The Musashi is hit another 10 times in the subsequent wave, and Admiral Kurita orders his fleet to retreat in order to get out of the range of the aircraft. Later that night, and under the cover of darkness, he orders the fleet to turn back around. The Musashi has been sunk and the Myoko crippled, but the rest of the fleet is still battle-worthy. Meanwhile, the Japanese Northern Force, made up of a large formation of Japan's remaining carriers, steams south toward the Americans. The move is a feint, however, and the carriers are only lightly armed and have about 100 aircraft between them. They're bait for the Americans to engage and thus pull their battleships and other defensive vessels from the San Bernardino Strait, which will leave the amphibious landing force vulnerable to Admiral Kurita's forces. The Americans suspect that the Northern Force is a feint, but a series of bad radio communications and poorly worded orders have sown confusion amongst the American commanders. Without a single unifying leader to command the entire operation, Admiral Halsey takes 3 of his carrier groups north to chase down the Japanese carriers. This leaves the American landing vessels completely unprotected from Admiral Kurita's battleships, except for a single escort carrier group. With the landing forces vulnerable, Japan's Southern Force attempts to link up with Admiral Kurita's ships, but to do that, it must sail through the narrow Surigao Strait. Yet, as the fleet enters the strait at 0300 hours on the 25th, it runs directly into an American trap set by the US's 7th Fleet Support Force. Scores of PT boats swarm the Japanese ship, loosing torpedoes at close range, though miraculously, not a single one manages to land a hit. Yet, as the fleet pushes back through the strait, it runs straight into the American battle line, and its 2 battleships are struck by torpedoes from American destroyers. The Yamashiro is able to power through the ambush, but the Fuso is badly hit and sinks 40 minutes later. 2 of the Japanese destroyers are also immediately sunk, and a third forced to retreat only to sink later. The rest of the fleet tries to escape the deadly ambush, but waiting past the destroyers are 6 American battleships. The Japanese are decimated, and with a single salvo of 12 14-inch shells, the Mississippi fires off the last battleship-to-battleship attack in history, closing a chapter in naval warfare forever. At the same time, Admiral Kurita's force has sailed through the San Bernardino Strait, completely unopposed. The American carriers and battleships meant to defend the landing craft off on a wild goose chase for the Japanese Northern Force. Now a force of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers steam down on a small force of American escort carriers, protected by destroyer escorts and light destroyers, catching them completely by surprise. Yet Admiral Kurita is unaware that the Northern Force has successfully lured away the bulk of the US fleet. Strict radio silence does not allow the three fleets to coordinate with each other. Thus, he orders his ships into an anti-aircraft formation in order to defend against an overwhelming air attack he believes is coming. It's only a half hour later that he realizes that the force he is facing is not the feared Third Fleet, and immediately orders a general attack. This sows confusion among the Japanese ships, who must now break their formation and link up for an independent division attack. Closest to the enemy, the destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, is first to respond. He sees the situation before him and knows that the landing vessels are doomed if the Japanese break through. On his own initiative, he steers his ship directly into the Japanese formation at top speed, firing her torpedoes and scoring direct hits on the heavy cruiser Kumano, which is forced to drop out of the fight. Upon seeing the reckless charge by the Johnston, the order is given for the rest of the American destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack. Hopelessly outgunned and dwarfed by the mighty battleships and heavy cruisers, the smaller American ships nonetheless take the Johnston's lead and sail straight into the teeth of the Japanese fleet. The Americans swarm the Japanese, who are not expecting this suicidal rush and are forced to drop out of their formations in order to avoid the spreads of torpedoes coming their way. Getting into knife fight range, the small American vessels are savaged by Japanese fire, but the determined ships manage to sow major confusion and seriously damage several of the larger Japanese ships. The escort carriers meanwhile launch every available plane, armed with anything that they can carry. The carriers know they're in a fight for their lives, and the planes are launched with nothing more than depth charges and machine guns if need be, as escort carriers are primarily armed for long-range recon and anti-submarine warfare, and are lacking the anti-shipping munitions carried by the larger main carriers. Yet, because the Japanese have no air cover, 450 American planes swarm the Japanese ships. Even inadequately armed as they are, they manage to cause serious damage to several vessels. Believing that he's facing the main American fleet due to the ferocity of the attack, instead of just a lightly armed escort group, Admiral Kurita orders a general retreat for his forces. Incredibly, the Japanese thus pass up their opportunity to seize victory and score catastrophic losses on the poorly defended troop transports. Kurita would go on to regroup his forces, but ultimately the Battle of Leyte Gulf is won here, and the Japanese defeat is ensured. Had Kurita correctly ascertained that he was facing no more than a light escort group, the US and Australian invasion force would have been decimated with severe loss of life, and Japan's sea trade routes would have remained open. With this withdrawal, however, Kurita had ensured that Japan's critical link to its oil supplies is forever severed, and a total defeat is inevitable. Since you got all the way to the end of this video, may I suggest watching the Battle of Thermopylae, Spartans versus Persians. Click that thumbnail in the next 5 seconds or it's too late. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bye-bye.